hearts in their mouth, frankly. And that isn't to say that necessarily how this begins is how this ends, this summit. There's many hours to go.
Dos Amigos grocery store in New York.
At that moment, President Putin sitting in the Beast, smiling and laughing, looking out the window, and just think about that he will have been aware there were photographers there. He's looking out the window as he laughs. He is somebody who understands the choreography of these kinds of things just as much as President Trump does. That is an image that will echo through history, given how many people have died and have been wounded as a result of President Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. The question of how that came about is still hanging, Kristen. So we are reading Russian journalists who are saying that there was a car for President Putin on the tarmac waiting for him. That it's not confirmed that it wasn't. That it was the case that that President Putin necessarily, in the end, intended to get in that car. But one of our Russia experts, one of our producers, has looked at the video and can see Russian plates on the car, can see that Russian presidential car there. So how was it that President Putin ended up in the vehicle with President Trump? I'm dwelling on this because it's the opening moments, the opening minutes after 6 years of the two men being together, because they appear to have been in the vehicle, perhaps without translators, certainly perhaps without note takers. And in the past, during the first Trump administration, moments when President Trump was with President Putin on their own, maybe just with a Russian interpreter, those moments have been incredibly controversial. And I'll just tell you this too. I have spoken with President Putin in English, not on camera, in the past, on some occasions. He has English. It is stilted. There is video of President Putin speaking in English during the run-up to the World Cup held in Russia, for example, or at Buckingham Palace. This is a long time ago now, making a speech in front of the Queen. But from my experience, President Putin's English is not fluent. So it will have been, maybe it just will have been niceties. Who knows? And in a sense, that is the point. Are we going to know what these two men said to each other in the opening moments of this absolutely crucial summit?
That is the point, because it effectively became a small bilateral meeting in and of itself in the back of the Beast, the presidential vehicle. Keir, stand by for me. I want to go now to Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, can you put those stunning optics into perspective? As Keir said, they are worth focusing on because these are the opening moments of this historic summit. And you saw Putin with that big grin. Certainly European allies watching very closely.
European allies and Volodymyr Zelenskyy and all of the mothers and fathers and spouses in Ukraine. Richard Engel reporting so memorably and compassionately yesterday on a funeral in Ukraine of a young soldier and the mother sobbing over the grave, and the long line of blue and gold, blue and yellow flags waiting for the next coffin to be lowered. Just to say, you and I were in Helsinki. We sat next to each other and we watched that unfold. The opening moments, like the opening moments in Helsinki when the two men stood next to each other and were you know, the camaraderie was palpable, and there was the validation in words of the Putin lies about the interference, the attempted interference in 2016, which the President of the United States accepted and invalidated his own intelligence agencies. So these things are so important. I had a flashback when I was thinking about today and watching that unfold, thinking about the Russian and Ukraine experts, the analysts, at the NSC, at the State Department, who no longer work there after the DOGE cutbacks and the rifts. The desks have been decimated, and to a certain extent, those also at the CIA. The people who did not go into planning, as one of our colleagues here, Evelyn Farkas, knows from her days at the Pentagon, the planning of a summit beforehand. What do you do if this happens? And I had a flashback to 1985 in Geneva, when the first meeting between an American president and a Soviet leader, Gorbachev and Reagan, and I'm standing there in the cold in Geneva watching Ronald Reagan. He had arrived earlier in the beast and had an overcoat on, but when he came down those steps to meet a 25-year younger man, Gorbachev in his 50s, Ronald Reagan was in a suit, and Gorbachev came out wearing a coat and a muffler and a hat. And that was a very careful, deliberate decision by the advisors to make the older man look younger and the younger man look older. And they also did that walkabout down to, down around by themselves. And that was the one-on-one that sealed the relationship. So these are important moments.
They're important moments. And Evelyn, boy, Andrea captures so
great.
well
Yeah.
the history and the extent to which these moments are usually so carefully choreographed. We know that, yes, there was this red carpet rollout, but we know that things are also shifting around in real time, like the fact that there are now 2 top advisors with each of these leaders in this initial bilateral. And just as of last night, I spoke with a U.S. official who said they are still planning a number of
It's right
things.
here,
So what do you
941.
make
So
of
the other
what
number
we have witnessed so far and what's unfolded so far in Alaska?
I mean, I feel like I have a split screen, in my brain, because on the one hand, based on what Andrea said and understanding diplomacy, you have to show respect to a leader that you're negotiating with, right? So President Trump is doing that, and he's trying to establish some kind of camaraderie rather than coming down hard. He's always said, I want to make sure that I can maintain a line of communication with Vladimir Putin. He wants to be different, although it's not that different from other presidents who have tried this. On the other hand, I think to myself, my God, this is a war criminal. This is a guy who has a warrant out for his arrest by the International Criminal Court. The only reason we didn't arrest him is because we're not party to that treaty. But he has, murdered not only Ukrainians, but every day there are about 1,000+ Russians dying or getting injured on the battlefield because of this man. He's kidnapped, of course, that's why he has the indictment. So I can go on and on. He's a war criminal. So the other part of me is, why do we have to roll out the red carpet for a war criminal? Why can't we just have him come inside the base and just do it in an austere kind of, tent or military building?
Keir, you'd have to imagine as President Zelenskyy watches this unfold that those are some of the questions he is asking. He, of course, was not invited to this summit. It's our understanding that President Trump wanted to have him at the summit, and yet President Putin wouldn't agree to that. So you have heard President Trump consistently throughout the course of this week put the focus on the next meeting that will include, he says, President Zelenskyy. Do you believe that if this meeting goes well, that President Zelenskyy will be ready to get on a plane, whether it be in the next several hours or several days?
Well, I would make one point that the actual meeting itself turned out to be 6 officials. So you had President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio and Ambassador, President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, on the one side, and then you had President Putin and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and a very senior Russian diplomat, Yuri Ushakov, on the other side. There are, on both sides, economic advisors, trade advisors. They weren't in that room. So does that mean then that the opening conversation is about Ukraine and is about a ceasefire and is about the kinds of things that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have said should be at the heart of this before you start to talk about anything else? Another point I think is worth noting, Kristen, is that just think back to the extraordinary optics in the Trump first term of President Trump with Kim Jong-un. And how much bonhomie there was there, and how history-making those images were, and then President Trump walked away. And so I think, and I'll tell you, from speaking to Russian officials, they know this very, very well. That President Trump is unpredictable. We know that. So we should just note that in the past, extraordinary images like these at the beginning of a summit have not meant that the summit went well, not necessarily with President Trump.
Keir, it's such an important point that you bring up, and I'm glad that you bring it up because, Andrea, we have heard President Trump say he will know within the first few minutes of meeting President Putin whether he's serious about this initial ceasefire agreement that President Trump wants to get. if he's serious about a longer peace deal. And you do have to think back to that moment when President Trump did walk away from Kim Jong-un. He held that solo news conference and said he wasn't ready to make a deal. Unpredictability is part of how President Trump governs, and he would argue it's part of how he gets deals done.
The difference here, though, is that President Trump does not know the details of Ukraine, whether, what villages, what, cities, what the military situation is. And even to be discussing territorial swaps is really concerning to the Ukrainians and the Europeans, because Putin is a master of this. He is the former KGB commander, the former KGB leader in East Germany. He has studied this. This land is the land that he wants to be part of the Soviet Union, the expanded Russia, and restore it the way the shirt or T-shirt or whatever it was that Lavrov, the wily foreign minister, was wearing today to indicate the CCCP. I mean, that is such a throwback and such an important signal. So that was a trolling of the U.S. side as well, and of certainly the Ukrainian and the Europeans.
And in a moment that is so high stakes, we pay attention to every single detail. And the fact that Sergei Lavrov would show up with that shirt on Evelyn Farkas, so many people took note of that, essentially sending a signal, reminding people of the USSR. Andrea makes the point about the discussion of land swaps. President Trump talked about it this week. It set off alarm bells for European officials. He then had a call with European leaders, with President Zelenskyy. He promised them, based on our reporting, that he would not negotiate territory without President Zelenskyy in the room. But the question is, and I think this is what Andrea's gotten to, when you talk about President Putin as a negotiator going into one of these rooms, he's a former KGB officer. He knows how to throw people off of their intended strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Putin will try to get his maximalist aims. He'll demand, as he always has, those two provinces. He will demand that Ukraine cannot join NATO and that there can be no NATO forces to enforce any kind of future agreement. I think, however, if he can't distract President Trump by talking about arms control or future business.
If I wasn't president, he would right now be taking all of Ukraine.
Keir, what do you make of his latest comments about the territory in Ukraine that Russia has illegally claimed?
Well, fact check. Vladimir Putin did want to take all of Ukraine, but it isn't because President Trump is president that he hasn't taken all of Ukraine in recent months. He hasn't been able to. Russia has been throwing blood and treasure at the front line and has been inching forward, as Andrea says, but only inching forward, honestly. I do think that President Putin believes that the Ukrainian front line could collapse. He's very likely wrong about, you never know in war, he's very likely wrong about that. But that, I suspect, will be driving him. Another point here, there has been confusion over exactly what the territory possibilities were. So some great reporting in the Wall Street Journal suggesting that it wasn't clear to the Europeans what the Russians said about Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, whether the Russians suggested that they would withdraw there, or whether, in fact, that wasn't part of an offer that was kind of privately made to Steve Witkoff in order to get this meeting to happen. And that's one of the reasons why, actually, we should be welcoming seeing the Secretary of State and Steve Witkoff in that room with President Trump up against, if you like, three Russians, President Putin and two others who have, just as Andrea pointed out, just have so much experience. So that there's that piece. Another piece too, the Russians have been signaling some questions about where this goes. So Yuri Ushakov, the senior diplomat who's in that room with President Putin and President Trump right now, was asked by a Russian reporter whether there'll be another meeting, and he dismissed that and said, well, let's just get through this meeting first. So I think the Russians are going to themselves take a litmus test of what they can get from this. But here's the point, and you've made it very well. they've already got so much, haven't they? Just from the
Yes.
optics of this, even if they walk away with no deal.
It's such a profound point, Keir, for you to make and highlight. And Evelyn, it speaks to this broader question. What does each side want? President Trump has said what he wants. He wants a ceasefire agreement. He wants another meeting. Does Russia want the same? Or is President Putin simply there to turn down the temperature with the U.S. to try to get some sanctions removed, to try to get a new nuclear START agreement?
President Putin is there to stall for time, Kristen. So I love Keir's description, because they're just, and Andrea said as well, just inching forward. But I think that Putin may well be told by his generals and his intelligence officers that they do have a chance to break through. In any event, he thinks time is on his side. Time suddenly wasn't on his side when President Trump seemed like he was getting impatient and he was going to put these secondary sanctions on him. So he said, hey, why don't we meet? This is a stalling tactic. And a ceasefire, unfortunately, without additional pressure and, frankly, really on the battlefield. The sanctions don't matter as much as sending arms to Ukraine, putting pressure on. Ukraine is hitting refineries. Ukraine is holding its ground. We could do a lot more to help them and put pressure on Putin.
Andrea, final point as we wrap up this initial segment.
Well, is the point of sanctions, again, today, the president on Air Force One flying out was asked, what would be the severe consequences if you don't think that Putin is serious about peace and a ceasefire? And he said, extremely severe, economic. Well, that's the secondary sanctions, but there are so many other reasons why those are complicated, especially against China. The president is trying to maintain a relationship with China. He has twice delayed his 90-day deadline for even putting tariffs, bilateral tariffs on China, because of those minerals, the minerals that the U.S. needs for batteries, for electric vehicles, and all sorts of equipment. The president has given an exemption to NVIDIA to sell chips to China. So he has done a lot of things that signal that he's not looking for a confrontation with China, and to crack down on China buying Russian oil, and India, to a lesser extent Brazil, which is already tariffed to death. It's a big step. They've already opposed unfreezing the Russian assets, $300 billion that could be unfrozen to rebuild Ukraine. There's a lot of steps that he could have taken so far.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. And that is why this moment, as we watch and wait to see what happens with the threat of potentially some more actions, we'll see how it all unfolds. Evelyn, Andrea, thank you. And Keir, thank you so much for getting us started. We really appreciate it. Great conversation. Joining me now is Ivo Dodler, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Ambassador Dodler, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. What do you make of everything that we have witnessed so far, this red carpet rollout, the fact that President Putin rode in the beast with President Trump, of course, that grin that we saw, and now they are having this meeting joined by top advisors?
It really is quite an extraordinary scene. Here you have a man who 11 years ago decided to invade a neighboring country, seize part of it, Crimea, and then continue to push for annexing part of his neighbor. Then a full-scale invasion just 3.5 years ago that has led to well over 1 million casualties, mostly Russian, but also lots of Ukrainians. A man who on a daily basis is shooting rockets and drones at cities and apartments and places where civilians live, to be treated as if he's some kind of, not only an equal, but some kind of person who deserves to be treated as if he's some kind of statesman, with the red carpets, with B-2 bombers flying over, and sitting in the beast, one of the most guarded places for the President of the United States. And there is grinning, cat-like, I would say, Vladimir Putin, looking out the window and telling people, look where I'm at. I'm in the president's car. What do you think? This is not a good omen if you care about the future of security in Ukraine, which is threatened by one person and one person only, and that's the one who's walking down the red carpet with the President of the United States. So it's a sobering sight, I must say.
Ambassador, given that the initial meeting went from President Trump to President Putin, they've now expanded that. So you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio in the room. You have Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in the room. Does that give you any more hope that this could actually lead to the temporary ceasefire agreement that President Trump is looking for?
Perhaps. I'm glad that Secretary of State / National Security Advisor Marco Rubio is in the room. He is a student of these kinds of negotiations, although he's, of course, never been in one directly with the president of Russia. But he has a long track record of understanding it. We know that Steve Witkoff may well be the president's best friend, but he's not one of the best negotiators. As Keir mentioned a little while ago, great confusion about what Steve Witkoff was learning from Vladimir Putin in their last the fifth time that they met in Moscow. So there is some reassurance that perhaps no big missteps will be had. But let's remember why this meeting is taking place. It's not taking place first and foremost to resolve the crisis in Ukraine. It is taking place on Vladimir Putin's side because what he wants is a normalization of relations with the United States, and on President Trump's part because he wants an end to the war, not because he thinks the war affects American security or indeed that he cares about European or Ukrainian security, but because he wants to be seen as someone who can end the war, who promised to do so in 24 hours. He failed in doing so in the first 6+ months, and he wants an end to the war. Those are two reasons that, in fact, have very little to do with Ukraine, which is why Ukrainians watching this at home are holding their breath in the hope that nothing bad happens behind their back.
Well, and let's pick up right there. The fact that President Zelenskyy is not a part of this initial summit, we know that President Trump wanted him to be. President Putin would not meet with President Zelenskyy. You've heard President Trump throughout the course of this week put so much focus on a follow-up meeting, basically downplaying the chances of any real breakthrough here today and saying the real progress will be made when President Zelenskyy and President Putin are in a room together. President Trump saying he assumes he'll be there as well. What is the significance of the fact that President Zelenskyy is not there?
Well, not only is it a huge significance that the victim of this war is not at the table, it is also significant that the meeting is taking place nevertheless. You're right that President Trump wanted to have a meeting that included both President Putin and President Zelenskyy. President Putin said no. And rather than the President of the United States, well, you know what? If you don't want to come with Zelenskyy, then I'm not going to have a meeting with you, and I'm going to put those severe economic sanctions on that I promised to do last Friday, and you'll have to take care of yourself. That's not what President Trump did. In fact, he said, oh, you know what? We'll just have another meeting so that we can see if there can be a meeting with Volodymyr Zelenskyy. It's quite remarkable that in some ways President Putin seems to have played President Trump to get this meeting, even though this was a meeting that was supposed to be about Ukraine and with Ukraine, and to suggest that I'm going to fly to Alaska, have a meeting, particularly this kind of reception with Vladimir Putin, only to make sure that we have a meeting next time in which the Ukrainian president is involved, suggests that perhaps the stronger person here is Mr. Putin rather than Mr. Trump.
All right. Well, a lot to unpack as we watch and wait to see what happens next. Former Ambassador Ivo Daldar, we really appreciate your perspective and expertise today. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Coming up, what's at stake as President Trump's and President Putin's face-to-face continues to get underway and the high-stakes decisions that could shape Ukraine's future. The live coverage continues straight ahead right here on Meet the Press Now. Stay with us.
Hey, I'm Hallie. We are coming on the air with fast-moving developments. Egg prices spiking, as anybody who has been to the grocery store has seen. What does this mean for people? Cheap AI. Talk to me like I'm me, and you know me. How big of a deal is this?
Listen to full episodes of Meet the Press wherever you get your podcasts. Kristen Welker hosts Meet the Press every Sunday on NBC.
Here's the scoop from NBC News, a new podcast where conversations and headlines are served daily.
I noticed he's people from Russia, and that's good. I like that because they want to do business, but they're not doing business until we get the war settled. 1 year ago, we were dead as a doornail, and now we have the hottest country, and he wants a piece of that because his country is not hot economically.
Welcome back. That was President Trump speaking on Air Force One on his way to Alaska for this historic summit, as President Trump and President Putin have been meeting for just over an hour so far. Back with me in Anchorage, Alaska, is NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake. So, Garrett, I'm starting to get reaction coming in, a trickle of reaction, mostly to say we're watching and waiting to see what will happen next. Some consternation over that big grin that we saw from President Putin. What are you hearing? And what we just heard from President Trump was quite notable, too, that we're not doing business until this war is solved.
Yeah, look, I mean, President Trump has talked publicly for quite some time here that he thinks Russia should be back again part of the global world order here. He's criticized G7 countries for making it the G7 by kicking Russia out, and has long suggested that, you know, the Ukraine war could have been avoided or that could be better ended by bringing Russia back into the negotiating table. That's something that Vladimir puts a stick. The tools that are available to him to punish Russia's economy almost certainly punish the American economy, too. You know, he's already punished India for buying Russian oil. The only people who buy more Russian oil than the Indians are the Chinese. Does he really want to go down a route that might further antagonize China while he's also trying to make a trade deal with them, a deal to, you know.
They just saw the results, but what they didn't see was the sleepless nights leading up to it. The countless hours of tedious work that went in and the toll it took
around the Ukrainian war. So I do think with his falling polling numbers around every other issue, I do think he does need a victory here. But what does that victory look like? We're not quite sure, and especially if he's giving away territory. Territory, by the way, without Ukraine at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of this is happening, we should remind our viewers, against the backdrop of ongoing violence. President Trump was asked about that aboard Air Force One. I want to take a listen to a little bit of how he responded to a question today.
We saw that Russia continued its violence into Ukraine last night, launching even more drones. What did you make of that?
I think they're trying to negotiate. He's trying to set a stage. I mean, in his mind, that helps him make a better deal. It actually hurts him. It helps him make a better deal if they can continue the killing. Maybe it's a part of the world. Maybe it's just his fabric, his genes, his genetics. But he thinks that makes him, gives him strength in negotiating. I think it hurts him.
Susan, it's such a fascinating answer to that question. And it also underscores that even if there is a ceasefire agreement, just how delicate and fragile it would be.
First, we have to give credit to Matt for knowing other foreign ministers who are sat in the back of the meeting. How much research?
I was sitting there for a little bit. Don't worry. I was ready to go.
That was impressive.
Yeah, I'm hoping you just didn't know that. Area of expertise. I would just note what the president said there in that response. It was not a condemnation of the continuing assault on civilians in Ukraine. It was, oh yeah, he's trying to negotiate, and maybe it's in his genes. And I think this is what makes some Western leaders so nervous, despite his recent rhetoric that he won't trade away territory. I don't think they can count on what President Trump is going to do.
Yeah, there is that air of unpredictability, and Matt Gorman, President Trump would argue that's what makes him a good deal maker, that you don't know what he's going to do, you don't know what he's going to say. He likes to keep the people he's negotiating with off guard. His critics would argue it's a chaotic way of trying to handle something that is so enormous. What do you make of it, and do you think that he has learned from his first summit with President Putin in 2018?
I think he has. I remember very vividly the Helsinki summit. That was not good for either him or the party writ large. I do think what's unique about this scenario, and unlike the Europeans, there is zero true political pressure on Trump from any extraneous forces that in his own party to get a deal done. This is about him legitimately, and I think rightly, wanting peace. He obviously wants a Nobel Peace Prize for his own reasons, but that it frees him up a little bit where there is not political pressure on this to go to a deal that doesn't work for either party. I think that's unique in that respect.
I think you're right. Cornell, this is such a fascinating event to watch unfold and to try to discuss through a political lens because Democrats want there to be inevitably he has learned lessons from those past meetings.
But with great admiration. I mean, one of the perplexing things about his first term was his admiration for Vladimir Putin and his kind of trust in him, even more than his own intelligence services. So surely Trump in his second term is very different from Trump in his first term. He's much more confident. He is much more sure what he wants to do. And I can tell you, you can tell he definitely wants to deal with this war because number one, he said he'd do it. He said he'd do it 200 days ago. And number two, because we are watching an extraordinary campaign for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, pick up on that point, Cornell, because former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said she would nominate President Trump if he could get a deal in which no territory was swapped. Obviously, anyone you talk to says there's going to be, as President Trump said in his own words, some quote-unquote swapping of territory. However, it was a notable moment.
Well, I'm sorry, but it's kind of gross. But you're talking about theater, and you're talking about someone putting themselves, again, front and center in a narcissistic way, when, again, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people being hurt. This man has taken children from Ukraine into Russia, right? This is not theater. This is serious and high stakes.
Yeah, even Secretary of State Marco Rubio once referred to him as a war criminal with 10 seconds left.
Putin, yeah. Look, this is peace is hard. I think that coming out of this, is he serious or is he not? We'll find out. Get to a second meeting.
All right, well, we're going to watch very closely. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Great conversation. We will be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now, but don't go anywhere. We will bring you more of the Trump-Putin joint press conference when that happens, if there is a joint press conference or if there's a solo press conference. And tune into a special edition of Nightly News with Tom Yamas live from Alaska. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC station. I'll have interviews with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Senator Chris Murphy. The news continues right now.
We are coming on the air tonight with the world holding its literal breath. What will happen with Presidents Trump and Putin meeting right now behind closed doors? This historic moment playing out with the fate of Ukraine on the line, what we know about what's going on inside that room. Plus, what about the people that are not at this meeting? Ukrainian and European leaders, all anxiously awaiting to learn whether the pair is going to walk away with a ceasefire, closer economic ties, or just go home empty-handed. We're going to bring you the latest from our allies overseas. Then the standoff between Texas Republicans and Democrats might be coming to an end. What the Dems' return to the state means for a redistricting plan that could alter the political map for decades to come. Plus, we are only hours away from a huge Air Canada strike, and it could leave thousands of passengers stranded. Is there hope for a last-minute breakthrough? And then to tonight's breakdown, what a tourism slump in a tourism capital means for the entire country. That is later on in the show. Hey, everybody, I'm Yasmin, and for Hallie tonight, the world right now is waiting as Presidents Trump and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, meet behind closed doors in Alaska at this historic summit that could end with peace in Ukraine or really nothing at all. As President Trump said late today, if things do not go the way he wants it to go, he is not afraid to walk out mid-meeting. But this moment is still a major victory for President Putin. It is hard to overstate just how big it is for the Russian president to be invited onto U.S. soil for diplomatic talks. Take a look at this. The red carpet rolled out literally for Putin as the pair shook hands on the tarmac at this military base outside of Anchorage. Then the U.S. giving Putin a show of force with his flyover, 4 fighter jets and a B-2 bomber buzzing by as the leaders walked up to the cameras. But this is the moment that everybody is talking about right now. In this unusual move, the pair got into the Beast together to ride to the summit site. Putin choosing this vehicle over his own, even flashing a smile to the cameras. On the flight over, Trump setting the stage, saying a ceasefire would be the only outcome that he would be truly happy with.
I'd like to see a ceasefire. I wouldn't be thrilled if I didn't get it, but everyone says you're not going to get the ceasefire. It'll take place on the second meeting. I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire.
So what are they talking about? Literally anything right now. The first indication of how things are going is going to come in just a couple of hours when the president is supposed to come out for a press conference, either with or without Vladimir Putin. Forward progress, according to President Trump, would also mean Ukrainian President Zelenskyy getting thrown into the mix for a second meeting. We have got this covered around the world. We have got Elise Labit from the Council on Foreign Relations here, Keir Simmons in London. We want to start, though, with Garrett Haake, who is at the summit in Anchorage tonight. Garrett, this summit could go in so many different directions. It is starting off, though, with a bang. Putin foregoing his own vehicle to jump in the beast with President Trump. Could this indicate the direction in which this thing is heading right now?
It could, Yasmin. It certainly shows a degree of warmth between the two men who will be driving the bus here today. But I would say the one indicator that we already have is the fact that this meeting has gone on as long as it has. We're already more than an hour into this bilateral meeting, expanded to have multiple additional advisors in it, that the president, remember, had said he would know if Vladimir Putin was serious about talking about peace within minutes. So we're well past that time frame here. The question is, how much more does Putin want to talk about? He has made pretty robust demands for a ceasefire or to end the war in Ukraine, including that Ukraine not get NATO membership and that they were able to keep many of the lands that Russia has already taken. They want more land that they've not been able to take by force. The question of land, of territory, so central to this war, is one that the president has put off, saying that he's not going to talk about that without Ukraine, even when he was asked about it today on Air Force One on the way out here. Let's listen.
They'll be discussed, but I've got to let Ukraine make that decision. And I think they'll make a proper decision. But I'm not here to negotiate for Ukraine. I'm here to get them at a table.
And Yasmin, that really is kind of the one clear goalpost that the White House has allowed to be set, that success here in Anchorage would be the establishment of another meeting with Presidents Zelenskyy and Putin, as well as President Trump.
Garrett, amidst all this, we also are learning that President Putin basically showed up with this kind of economic business delegation wanting to talk about possible mineral exchanges, talk about lifting sanctions, nuclear weapons treaties. Is Trump up for that today?
I think so. I mean, the president has long viewed a lot of these issues as intertwined. He's talked repeatedly about the fact that Russia was kicked out of the G8, making it the G7, that he thinks they need to be more integrated. And the only way you really get peace and prosperity is through integration and through trade. And he's putting his money where his mouth is, if you will, by bringing along some of his own top economic advisors today. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is here. So, too, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. If this meeting today was only about war and peace, I have a hard time imagining any particular role for those two men.
Garrett, I want to look at this from a domestic lens for a moment, if we can, especially when it comes to the president's base. And the president, when he got elected, said he was going to get this thing done on day one. It is 200-plus days, and this thing is not done, and possibly far from it, depending on what actually happens today. Is he ruffling any base feathers at this point with the timeline?
Well, look, he's managed to offload a lot of the responsibility for this war to Europe and to our allies. Just think about the fact that he said that more military equipment that goes to Ukraine will be purchased by NATO than given to Ukraine, as opposed to the manner in which it was done during the Biden administration. But the president really has been torn here between his base and our allies, our European allies who want more, Ukraine who wants more U.S. involvement, want us to have Ukraine's back, and his political base, whom he has conditioned over the course of this campaign to expect that this war was going to be over already and that the U.S. wasn't going to have anything more to do with it. His handling of the war is underwater. In most public polls, about 41% support the way that Trump's handled the war, depending on how you ask the question. That's roughly in line with his sort of overall approval, or at least his floor with his political base. I don't see the bottom falling out on him here. His people tend to be with him through thick and thin, but it has been a challenge for him to navigate this politically, at least in keeping with his campaign promises, so often expressed, to get the U.S. out of this war entirely and to have it all wrapped up on day one, 206 days ago.
Garrett Haake, I know you're going to stay close to the camera for us, so we thank you for that, my friend. I want to go to Keir Simmons now, who's standing by for us. And Keir, I think it's important for viewers to understand kind of the anxiety that the Ukrainians are feeling, right? This is a Russia-Ukraine war. But as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine is not at the table. The possibility that maybe Zelenskyy could join as a second meeting if, and here's the key word, if this one is successful, is on the table. But nonetheless, what is the sense we're getting from inside Ukraine, both from the president along with the citizens?
Yeah, it may be painful. It may be a long, painful wait. And Garrett may have to wait 6 or 7 hours. I may be waiting 6 or 7 hours. If the Kremlin's prediction comes to pass, that's how long these talks take. And the Ukrainians, as you rightly highlight, are not in there. So they are on the outside watching. They had to watch those images of President Putin in the beast, smiling and laughing, knowing that this is the man who launched the invasion of Ukraine that has led to so many deaths and so many casualties and so many families divided and so many children killed. And all of that was just the opening minutes of this.
Yeah.
And we're still understanding exactly what happened just in those opening minutes. And it is important because, well, first of all, that image of President Putin on American soil, sitting in a vehicle with the American president and smiling and laughing, that will echo through history. There's that piece. But also, it's going to tell us something, isn't it, about where this is all going. And according to Russian journalists, President Putin did have his own vehicle on the tarmac waiting. One of our producers, a Russia expert, has, in the video, seen the vehicle with Russian plates there waiting. So did President Putin take the opportunity to start a bilat with President Trump immediately? Was there any note taker there? Was there a translator there? I've spoken in English with President Putin in the past. It's a stilted conversation. He can speak some words of English, but it isn't, that doesn't flow. So exactly what were the two men talking about? And in the past, during the first Trump administration, President Putin and President Trump together, without any note-taking, has been extremely controversial. And I suspect that moment will be too.
Well, also, Keir, kind of the optics of this whole thing, right? The way in which he shook President Putin's hand, they wrote, as you mentioned, in the beast together, the way he welcomed him to U.S. soil. You compare that, right? You split screen that moment with the Oval Office moment sitting alongside Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, in which the president admonished Zelenskyy, right? As if he was a child to a certain extent. Those optics, I imagine, is not playing well amongst Ukrainians, especially considering if this does move on to a second meeting, wondering whose side is President Trump actually going to be on?
Yeah, and President Trump is unpredictable. And I know from Russian officials that the Russians also view President Trump as unpredictable. And so they are aware that just because this whole thing begins with that kind of bon ami doesn't mean it will end that way. Doesn't mean that President Trump won't walk away. I mean, I think that's the way the Russians will see this, and they will be being careful and diplomatic about, and they'll have tactics playing out right now as we speak. I will say too, though, that the Ukrainians have learned a lot since that Oval Office meeting with President Zelenskyy, and you can see it in the way that Ukraine behaved since this summit was announced, a week ago or so. That they have been, I mean, really, although there are negotiations happening now in Anchorage, the negotiations are happening all week with the Europeans and the Ukrainians making their case.
Keir Simmons for us. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. I want to bring in now our own Andrea Mitchell and Elise Labid as well. Elise is an Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of Cosmopolitics on Substack. Andrea, I'm going to start with you on this one. The president has said today's summit is meant to kind of set the table for this trilateral meeting between Putin and Zelenskyy. What needs to come from this meeting in order for that to happen?
Probably a ceasefire, because it would be very difficult to have a trilateral meeting if they've not even achieved the baseline of stopping Russia from attacking Ukraine. Although, given what's happened so far, the warm greeting, the traveling together in the beast, the one-on-one, even briefly in the limousine, which was more than just a red carpet, it was an extraordinarily warm greeting, and you saw the grin. You can see it there from Vladimir Putin. He knew exactly what he was achieving in this very, very warm welcome. All of that had to be really numbing, if not really frightening for Volodymyr Zelenskyy, for Ukraine, for the men and women in their armed forces, the mothers and those who are grieving the loss of their children. some 20,000 children that were kidnapped by Putin. And the European allies, including Keith Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, who's been coaching Zelenskyy on how to flatter and be nice to Donald Trump and not have him blow up as he did in the Oval Office. So will he have the strength, the legs, the political ability to say no to a meeting? Perhaps not. But I should think that the bottom line should be a ceasefire, even though it's a ceasefire that most of Ukraine's supporters don't think that Putin would observe.
Elise, you can't help but think about Helsinki as we await what comes from this meeting. And just to remind folks, this was a meeting in President Trump's first term in which they spoke extensively about Russian interference in the 2016 election. And it was a one-on-one. There was no really accountability in that room at the time. And during the press conference, President Trump walked out and he said, essentially, Russia did not interfere in the American election. And a reporter asked, how do you know that, sir? And he said, because he told me. And he pointed at President Putin. And the question is now, going into this thing, right? President Trump has repeatedly praised Putin, but over the last couple of weeks, he has grown a little bit wary of him. And so the question is whether or not President Trump is going to walk out of this meeting still wary of President Putin and/or make this about face and go back to the President Trump of former, who saw Putin as a trustworthy political figure.
Well, it's when we talk about the unpredictability of President Trump, this is exactly what everybody's worried about. But I will say, I think President Trump learned from that meeting. He got a lot of flack, not just from everybody in the government, in the world, but also from his own party. I don't think that was a really good moment for Republicans. And now you see, just to go back really quick to, Republicans actually are increasing their support for aiding Ukraine. So I think he has a little bit more wind in his back. He has a little bit more confidence. And you've seen, President Trump admitted himself. When does this president ever admit that he's being played? He said, look, I think this guy's playing me. I really don't know. I think he's going into this meeting very circumspect. Obviously, he wants to have a good relationship with President Putin. And President Putin has that charm offensive when he gets into the room with him. We saw that in the car right now in the Beast. But I do think President Trump, my understanding is over the last couple of days, there was some confusion about what Steve Witkoff discussed with the Russians. My understanding is President Trump has been reaching out to a lot of supporters of Ukraine, people that are a little bit more expert in the issue. And you see now President Trump is bringing Marco Rubio in. He's bringing Witkoff in. Right. I think he's fortifying himself for what he knows could be a lot of pressure from the Russian president.
Andrea, in White Houses other than President Trump's, oftentimes the leverage part of it is the meeting with the president. That is part of the negotiations. It is not step one in the negotiations. It's maybe step 3 or 4, right? You build to that. In this case, it is step 1, right? They have lost that part of the leverage of these negotiations. So what, in fact, does the U.S. have as leverage going into this?
Well, when he was asked what would you do if he doesn't indicate, a peaceful, that he wants peace or a ceasefire, he talked about severe consequences. And when asked on the flight out, what did he mean by severe consequences? He said economic, severe, very strong economic consequences. That's secondary sanction, rare earth minerals. It's unclear whether he would really lay those sanctions down. There is a bill, as you know, in the Senate, supported by Lindsey Graham and other top supporters of the president, allies of the president, but that bill also gives the president a way out. So they're not going to pass it and without that waiver, where he can always make sure whether or not it goes.
By the way, this is the most fashion-matched panel I have seen all day, with both Elise and Andrea in the exact same suit color and shirt as well. You got to love that. You certainly got the memo.
And we're not in the same studio.
Path, and what areas here are most at risk?
I first have to say, we are so fortunate that this forecast has not changed, because we expect this to become a beast of a hurricane, and thankfully, it's not going to be directly hitting any land areas as of now. We still got about 5 to 6 days until it's completely gone and racing out into the open Atlantic. So we're going to stare at it very closely all weekend long, and especially if you're in the Outer Banks, you're probably the ones that would be most vulnerable if we get any more shifts closer to you. So right now it's a Category 1, but it's already already a big storm, a huge cloud shield. So these storms don't have to be powerful to be big. This one, by the time we're done with the weekend into next week, it's going to be powerful and huge. So it's going to have a big footprint. So this is the new forecast out from the Hurricane Center. And you can see how it just skirts north of Puerto Rico here. Fringe effects there, breezy, some squally weather, rough seas, that type of thing. No damage expected. Same thing goes for the Bahamas. Florida, looks like the storm's safely to your east. And notice how strong it gets. 145-mile-per-hour max winds, Category 4. We only get maybe one of those a season getting up that strong. So here's our European model, just to show you how close we're going to get to the East Coast. This is the closest. So this would be Tuesday at 5 p.m. It's about as close as Aaron will get to the Bahamas and Miami, 560 miles. So you really shouldn't have any other impacts besides huge waves. But people don't realize how far on a map eastern North Carolina and the Outer Banks sticks out. I mean, the storm, when it goes past the center here, is only going to be 250 miles due east of Cape Hatteras. That's pretty close. You can already see where those fringe bands are, not far offshore. So if we get any further shifts closer to the Outer Banks, we're going to start to bring more impacts into areas of eastern North Carolina. That's one of the most important things to watch. And as far as our friends in Cape Cod and New England, it's still about 550 miles offshore. So, again, the big story is that the rip currents, the rough seas, the beach erosion. But, Yasmin, if we get any shift closer to the East Coast, things will get more serious quickly.
Yeah, let's hope this thing stays off coast and on track of where it is now. Bill Cairns for us. Thank you. I want to take you to Texas now, where the weeks-long standoff over the Republican redistricting plan to add up to 5 more GOP House seats could actually be close to an end. You got Democrats signaling they're going to get ready to return to the state after leaving in an effort to block Republicans from adopting this redrawn congressional map. One that could really shake up who controls the halls of the U.S. Capitol in the years to come. The Texas House gaveling back into session twice today, but didn't have the numbers to vote or essentially get anything done. Now the state's House Speaker says any Democrats who return home over the weekend will be arrested and brought back to the Capitol immediately. Want to bring in Ryan Chandler, who's standing by for us in Austin, to talk more about this. How soon, Ryan, you think Dems might come back to the Texas legislature and hit those numbers?
Well, every indication that I've gotten from Democrats in Chicago is that it's very likely that they will return to give the Texas House a quorum come Monday. So that dam that has been stopping progress from Republicans from making progress on this bill will lift, and we could see the new Texas redistricting maps pass as early as later next week. For all month, Democrats have been fighting this fight in the media, in other state houses, getting assurances from states like California that they will retaliate. Now they say they'll return to their own state house with preparations of fighting this fight in the courts. Here's a little of how Democrats that were here on the House floor today are framing this debate now.
We got to return to why we are here. We have a convicted criminal in the White House that is asking for 5 additional seats for him to remain in power. That should scare any one of us, whether you're an independent, a Democrat, or a Republican.
So Democrats, for their part, can certainly claim victory in the way that they have ignited a national controversy over these maps, getting assurances from other Democratic states that they will respond in kind with their own maps. Yeah.
Ryan Chandler for us. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it. In the last few minutes or so, the mayor of D.C. and the city's attorney general speaking outside court after arguments wrapped, with the feds agreeing to scale back their operations, at least in part, as city officials take the Trump administration to court over its takeover of D.C.'s police department. The power struggle there reached new heights tonight, and Washingtonians are making their thoughts known. You can see this big group of protesters there posted up outside the courthouse. All of it happening after Attorney General Pam Bondi announced overnight that she was naming the DEA administrator as the emergency D.C. police commissioner, sidelining the city's police chief, Pamela Smith. But the White House still says this plan is working, with 33 arrests overnight, about half of them immigration-related. Remember, the average, according to Metro PD, is about 70 daily arrests in the district. Want to get right to Ryan Riley, who's standing by for us. Give us here kind of the major headline, Ryan, if you will, out of court, as we head into what could be an even more intense weekend of clashes and Bondi threatening action in other cities as well.
Yeah, so Pam Bondi appeared, I believe, on Fox News last night. I think we have a clip of that, what she was saying. Take a look. Take a listen.
D.C. sanctuary city, L.A. sanctuary city, California sanctuary state.
what does this mean in reality for all of these locations, municipalities, states moving forward?
They must comply. Yesterday, I sent out 33 letters to mayors around this country. I think 3 or 4 of them were in California alone. We want to know what you're doing to comply with our federal government. They have 5 days to respond to me.
And so I just came back from court for this sort of long hearing before a judge about this takeover of the D.C. Police Department. And at the end of it, basically, the judge said the two sides should get together, and they spent more than an hour talking about these issues and eventually agreed to scale back on Pam Bondi's order. So a little bit of, I think, a victory for D.C. residents or for the city of D.C. For at least for now, in terms of like replacing the entire structure. But, this is an issue I think that will be continuing, Yasmin. This is not the end of this fight.
I want to talk about this thing that we've been following all week, right? This guy in this viral video throwing a sandwich at a federal officer. Now released after a judge called the charges against him, quote unquote, excessive. What more do we know?
Well, he was, in fact, a DOJ employee. And if you look at that video that you showed earlier in the show where they are doing that sort of raid, what was sort of incredible there that the White House posted this video is that that's what this was all about, right? So he faced these local charges. He was arrested on the scene, and then they upped them to federal charges. And this is an instance where you could have had just a normal surrender situation and have him just go into court, in federal court, to, comply. He was already had been, released on his own recognizance. So you could have had him in, but instead they sort of put together that flashy video with underlying sound and a lot of force for going in an apartment in one of the nicest part of the cities to take him into custody. So I think clearly the White House trying to send a signal there, even with its case involving a sandwich.
Ryan Riley for us. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, we got a lot more coming up, folks. President Trump and President Putin have been behind closed doors for just about 2 hours or 2 hours or so. A White House official saying the working lunch with the expanded delegation has not yet started. We're keeping an eye on this, and we're going to bring you an update as soon as we get it, of course. Plus, is it the canary in the casino why what happens in Vegas's economy will actually not stay in Vegas? And then how a horse ended up like this.
Hey, I'm Hallie, and we are coming on the air with fast-moving developments. Those inflation numbers, there's a lot in the weeds here. We don't love to live in the weeds, but Christine Romans does. She's joining us now to help us understand it. Egg prices spiking, as anybody who has eyeballs that has been to the grocery store has seen. What does this mean for people? Cheap AI. Talk to me like I'm me, and you know me. How big of a deal is this?
We've managed to arrange a beautiful full moon.
I get it.
Wouldn't do this for just anyone, Hallie.
I want you to just vibe in the moment.
The serious punishment in a scandal that has rocked college sports. We're going to tell you that, but up.
Sean still to this day doesn't know how much money is in his bank account and does like to buy nice stuff.
Remember, his mother was found guilty of fraud and grand theft as well. She got sentenced to 5 years in federal prison last month. Prosecutors said Kingston and his mother used his celebrity name to trick luxury businesses into delivering things to them before getting payment. The payments were then made using fraudulent or worthless wire transfers. Kingston and his mom ended up stealing more than $1 million worth of stuff. According to arrest warrants, the pair defrauded a jewelry business, a luxury bed company, car dealerships, and a TV company. Jesse Kurse is joining us now with more on this outside the courthouse. Jesse, the sentence, it could have been worse, right? The government had asked for more time. What happened in court and what's coming next?
Yeah, so prosecutors, Yasmin, had asked for 60 months behind bars. He wound up getting sentenced to 42 months, as well as 3 years of supervised release. His attorneys have been pushing for him to spend no time behind bars. His legal team arguing that Sean Kingston should have just served time under house arrest, which he had been doing leading up to his sentencing. His attorneys had pointed to several things, including the fact that they say that he had repaid much of what was owed. They pointed to what they say were good works he'd done in the past, including serving meals around Thanksgiving to those in need. But the judge clearly determined that Kingston needed to spend at least some time behind bars. We did hear from Kingston's legal team afterward. We did not hear from Kingston himself because he was immediately taken into custody. Here's part of what we heard from Kingston's legal team.
I think that anybody who buys diamond jewelry, and you all know from social media, I would call it an addiction. Just like people who have an addiction to gambling get a lower sentence, I would say that this was an addiction to nice stuff.
And here's also a look, Yasmin, at some of the figures that have been discussed in this case. And at this point, the amount of restitution is still TBD. There's a hearing set in October, or I should say in October. That is when we are expecting a conclusion to the amount of money that Sean Kingston will still owe, unless there is any kind of agreement reached between prosecutors and the defense team in between between now and then. And that is what played out outside of the courthouse. We're actually in Miami now, so we're in the general area, but that's what played outside the courthouse. Again, we saw Sean Kingston going into the courthouse. He didn't say anything to us when I asked him what he was going to say to the judge, but he did make some brief comments in the courtroom. He made the push to be able to
Imagine being able to build anything just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44.
Is now facing conspiracy to commit wire fraud and obstruction charges. NBC News reached out to the mayor's lawyer. They're not commenting for now. At number 3, the NCAA hitting Michigan's football team with tens of millions of dollars in fines over a years-long scouting and sign-stealing scheme. The head coach will also be suspended for 3 games. Former coach Jim Harbaugh barred from the NCAA for 10 years. We reached out to Michigan for comment. We have not yet heard back. At number 4, Pandora now warning U.S. consumers prices could rise significantly because of tariffs. The massive jewelry company putting out a new earnings report showing it's expecting to take a $31 million hit because of the trade fight. But it's a bit of a complicated picture here. The new numbers show U.S. shoppers are still spending on jewelry for now. All right, number 5, scientists in Australia discovering a 25-million-year-old fossil, revealing that long before whales were majestic giant creatures, their ancestors were actually pretty tiny and really wild. Look at this. The ancient whale has a Pokemon-looking face and big, powerful jaw. They seem to be related to humpbacks. All right, new numbers on the state of tourism in Las Vegas now have experts worried at the national level. You got locals in the city saying they're seeing this empty strip, less tips, and the numbers are backing that up. According to Las Vegas's Convention and Visitors Authority, so far this year, the city's seeing 1.5 million fewer tourists than last year. The big question is, what does that tell us about where the country is actually going? Camila Bernal explains it in tonight's breakdown.
What happens in Vegas could spell trouble for the U.S. economy. The subject of chatter on social media for months now. Empty streets and casinos. One even saying Vegas is actually dead. Another calling it a ghost town. While maybe a bit extreme, the numbers do back up a summer tourism slump. Visitors coming into Las Vegas in June down more than 11% compared to last year, and down more than 7% for the whole year.
It's slow. When I drive down the strip going to work in the morning, and I barely see visitors out there.
Hotel room occupancy and convention attendance dropping by the tens of thousands.
Judging from all the videos and movies.
I can tell that she has a great sense of humor, but she hasn't told me a joke yet.
Want a career as a pet psychic? We're not the school for you. Want a career-focused degree that's fast, flexible, and affordable? Apply now at post.edu. Post University.
3, 2, 1, go! First person to land all 6 bottle flips wins challenge 1. This video is sponsored by Go-Go Squeeze.
Years of booming home values in the area.
We tend to get hit the first and the hardest, and then slower than others to recover.
In part because hospitality and tourism make up more than a quarter of the city's workforce. But over the last decade, it's been rebuilding and rebranding, trying to diversify the economy, snatching up sports teams from Oakland, transforming the Strip into an F1 racetrack.
We're underway in Las Vegas.
And the high-tech Sphere that's become a hot concert destination and a new landmark of the city. Ironically, one thing that hasn't taken a hit this summer, gambling. Even as high rollers have options galore, with the online sports betting industry taking off, folks are still spending on the casino floors.
If you like to gamble, Vegas is your town.
The Vegas slump, just part of the wider expected tourism slowdown this year. One group estimating that the U.S. tourism market will fall by $12.5 billion in 2025. Many pointing to the ripple effects of President Trump's tariff announcements, angering potential visitors like Canadians.
Used to we have like lot for Canadian, and now no.
New data showing flights into Las Vegas from Canada down by more than 18% compared to last year. The Convention and Visitors Authority emphasizing the city's commitment to our neighbors to the north.
That's a long-term relationship, and we're going to figure that out.
And while the full impact of tariffs hasn't been felt in prices just yet, they are estimated to cost the average American household $2,400 a year. That would be less money to spend in an increasingly expensive city.
We spend in over our budget. I think everything is quite expensive.
Experts say it's still too early to say for sure whether this is a temporary Vegas slump or if it's the beginning of a bigger trend, meaning the next few months could be crucial in finding out whether the House really does always win.
And Camila Bernal is joining us now with more on this. It seems like local officials there, though, they feel confident that this kind of isn't the beginning of some major economic bust.
They do, and I think most importantly is the fact that people still want to gamble. Local officials and local leaders really pointing to a few things and staying positive, saying they have a great entertainment lineup for the summer and for the fall. And I don't know about you, but I had a lot of friends that wanted to go see the Backstreet Boys at the Sphere this summer. There's also this idea of the fact that when it gets and also when it gets really hot in Vegas, what happens is that it slows down. People don't want to be in 100+ degree weather. And then, of course, local leaders and local officials, they are still reaching out to our Canadian friends. They're trying to get them to come back and also trying to talk to travel agents to try to offer them deals in hotels and trying to get everybody back in Vegas. And so while they are staying very positive, there is some very concerning numbers. So we'll see what happens, despite the fact that a lot of the local leaders say that Vegas is not really going to see a problem in the coming months.
By the way, I messed that up. It's Backstreet's back. All right.
All right.
Camila Bernal, thank you. Appreciate it. Coming up, we're keeping a close eye on those podiums right there in Alaska. That is where President Trump and President Putin will speak after their meeting. We're going to keep you posted as soon as we hear anything. Plus, the strike that could bring a huge airline to a halt, stranding passengers all over the world in just hours. And the tense moments leading up to the rescue of a missing hiker.
NBC News Daily. Weekdays from 12 to 4 on NBC News Now.
Here's The Scoop, a new podcast from NBC News, where our journalists take a deep dive into the day's top stories, bringing you closer to the headlines and conversations that are shaping our world. From the front page to the zeitgeist in 15 minutes or less. Listen daily wherever you get your podcasts.
News for the generation of now is NBC News Now.
Welcome back. Air Canada just hours away from canceling nearly all of its flights ahead of a looming flight attendant strike set for around 1 a.m. tonight. The strike expected to impact something like 130,000 passengers every day. It's coming after contract negotiations with the airline's 10,000 flight attendants stalled because of a fight over pay, with both sides standing firm.
Our latest offer included an increase of 38% in total compensation, including benefits and pensions over 4 years.
Our union offices in Vancouver and Toronto have had to open food banks to support our newest members as they struggle to house and feed themselves while working full-time at Air Canada and Air Canada Rouge.
Maya Eaglin is joining us now with more on this. I mean, Air Canada, the largest carrier in Canada. I think there's a couple implications here. One is, of course, the biggest one, which is the passengers, but also, obviously, these flight attendants making some demands. We heard about pay obviously being a major one.
Right.
What else are we looking at here?
Yeah, so one of the biggest demands from the flight attendants here are to be compensated more fairly. But right now, up to 500 flights could be canceled by the end of the day, according to Air Canada, because it's taken so long to reach an agreement. Both sides standing pretty firm. And that's left some people stranded at their destinations, wanting to hop on those flights that get canceled. There's a lot of frustration. Let's take a listen to some of the folks on the ground.
Okay, Air Canada, here we go again. Don't trust them.
They can't just leave a passenger stranded on the godforsaken, airport. We don't know where to go.
We think that they should get paid for what they're doing. If they're not getting paid for those hours boarding and deplaning, they should be paid for that.
Now, hundreds of customers could be impacted by these cancellations, but here's the union's demands. Okay, so they want increased wages. Yeah. There's a bunch of signs that say unpaid work won't fly, poverty wages equals un-Canadian. They also want compensation for labor outside of the aircrafts. So when the flight attendants aren't on the plane, some of them say they're not getting paid for their time. And the final demand is better working hours.
I know that amidst all of this, there was also this Air Canada subsidiary that had a short landing, right? What happened there?
Yes, so this happened yesterday. It's still all under investigation. We have a statement from the FAA that reads, an Air Canada flight landed on the runway threshold and struck lights at Nashville International Airport around 5:30 p.m. local time on Thursday, August 14th. The aircraft taxied to the gate. The flight departed from Toronto, and the FAA and NTSB are still investigating. So it's a bit too early to know whose fault this was, if it was the pilot, if it was the air traffic control, but that's all under investigation. We'll be monitoring.
Maya Eaglin, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so we cover hundreds of stories every day, and because it's tough to read, watch, or listen to all of them, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment that we call The Local. Peace Bureau. Take a look at this. A huge fire burning on top of a New York City apartment building. More than 150 first responders rushing to the scene around 10 o'clock this morning. You can see some of them here battling those flames. 3 firefighters suffered minor injuries, but nobody else was hurt. The cause under investigation.
So you're looking to grow your business, but you don't have time to focus on hiring? I got you. Everyone thinks I've unlocked some new levels.
Behind a waterfall on Tuesday, a special system had to be used to pull him to safety. We're told tonight he was treated for dehydration, but is back with his family. All right, out of our Washington, D.C. bureau, another rescue to tell you about, but it's a little more unusual. A horse is okay after falling about 10 feet into a pit in the yard of a Baltimore home. The animal escaped from a farm a few miles away. Firefighters lifted the horse out using a crane after a vet climbed down to sedate it. The homeowner says plywood was covering the pit to make sure no person stepped in it. All right, still ahead, we are keeping a close eye on those podiums right there in Alaska. That is where President Trump and President Putin will speak after their meeting. We'll keep you posted as soon as we hear anything. Plus, the disaster that caused one county in Michigan to use drones and AI to keep their sewage pipes working. We'll explain next.
Here's the scoop from NBC News, a new podcast where conversations and headlines are served daily.
News for the generation of now is NBC News Now.
Kristen Welker hosts Meet the Press every Sunday on NBC.
News lives in the now.
Look at this. You can't even see anything anymore.
Let's break down what we know.
You gotta see this.
News for the generation of now is NBC News Now.
NBC News Daily. Weekdays from 12 to 4 on NBC News Now.
All right, welcome back. You might not think about it very often, but right now, a few stories under your feet, your entire county's sewage system is working really hard. It's basically invisible infrastructure, and it usually requires a lot of manpower and a lot of money to keep it going. But after a disaster, one county in Michigan is using drones, 3D printing, and AI to keep their pipes running smoothly and saving millions while they're doing it. NBC's Shaq Brewster takes us there.
This high-powered drone, not usually associated with sewer systems, is Macomb County, Michigan's answer to preventing scenes like this.
A grim prospect for residents threatened by this massive sinkhole.
Christmas Eve 2016, a sinkhole the size of a football field.
Started when an 11-foot wide sewer line located 45 feet below ground burst, spilling raw sewage under the neighborhood and triggering the sinkhole.
What was arguably the largest infrastructure disaster in Michigan history.
More than 20 homes evacuated, with at least 3 of those destroyed. Luckily, nobody was hurt. The county blaming human error, a mess that took 9 months and roughly $75 million taxpayer dollars to fix.
We are never going to have another sinkhole in Macomb County. We have done a number of things now to shore up our underground infrastructure.
Launching new tools like this, essentially a poop drone.
So this is our drone. This is from Flybotics. It's the ACOX.
Looks fancy.
It is fancy. The first thing you see is the protective cage around it. Very important.
The drone is sent into the sewer systems, recording 4K video with lights as powerful as those at a stadium.
There's sensors all the way around the drone.
Sensors detecting hazardous gases, sometimes found in pipes that are usually inspected by humans.
Carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, you name it, you can run into it down there. So it's putting people in a potentially dangerous environment.
But it's also about efficiency. This team saying it can inspect almost 1,000 feet of underground pipes in just one flight.
So what we're going to do is just do a quick little inspection of the piping that's within this gallery here.
What things are you looking for?
So we're looking for, are there tree roots in the pipe? Is the pipe cracked anywhere? Is there water dripping into the pipe?
Oh.
Don't get too close to the
I
hole.
will not.
And the flying drone has a floating cousin in the GoFlow, a boot created and 3D printed by this team.
Lower it down. It's getting footage right now. We got splashdown.
After a flight or a float, the team uploads the footage to a system called Sewer AI that detects and alerts engineers to anomalies within the infrastructure.
What used to take us months to get an answer, we now are able to get something in about 24 hours. And we have already saved literally millions of dollars with this new technology.
In 2023, Macomb County spent nearly $1 million on contractor inspections. Next year, using the new tech, they estimate inspections will cost just $46,000.
It's out of sight, out of mind. As most people see it, you have to go in and look at it because if you don't, the results are catastrophic.
Hoping to prevent catastrophe right under our feet. Shaquille Brewster, NBC News.
Shaq Brewster, thank you. All right, coming up, you're seeing it, you're looking at it, what we've been watching all day. We are now hearing President Trump and President Putin are still talking privately in Alaska. We're going to bring you the updates as we get them. Plus, let the games begin. Our Janice McNamara takes us inside the very first Robot Olympics.
Taking over the helm of a 75-year-old broadcast, it's a great responsibility.
Wildfire continues to be a threat to this community.
You have to go in there.
With that massive hurricane comes the massive response.
To bring people at home closer to the story.
This group right here just crossed the Rio Grande.
The best reporters in our business know how to listen. And when you listen, you get the truth.
For NBC News. NBC News, I'm Tom Yams.
And that's what we do every night.
Let's get to tonight's original with in-depth reporting on a topic that we have been watching. And tonight, it is about China's latest push forward in the AI race with the first of its kind robot Olympics, sort of. It's kicking off in Beijing today. The World Humanoid Robot Games brings together robots from around the world, competing in basically every category from martial arts to a 400-meter race. It's less about going for gold, though, here, and more about testing new tech. Figuring out how robots can be used day to day, even with some technical difficulties. Janice Mackey-Frere has more.
This is not your average sports tournament. At what is billed as the first ever World Humanoid Robot Games, the athletes come in all shapes, sizes, and structure to compete in events ranging from running to kickboxing to soccer. For 3 days, human handlers from 16 countries are putting machines through the motions to show the potential of embodied AI as well as its limitations. It isn't about winning or losing, but it's a way to trial the robots in agility, endurance, and battery life. Some of the humanoids are competing in more practical job skills, like sorting medicine and hotel concierge duties. That's why a team from Starbot made the trip from California. Their robots work in customer service.
Do you think humans are ready to have robots so involved in their daily lives?
I think so. As a matter of fact, our company already works at restaurants, and we already have robots providing service to customers, and they are welcomed really well. So I think perhaps not everyone, but I think we are ready as a society to incorporate robots into the environment.
The games are meant to showcase how far robotics have come and to provide a window into a future where humanoids are integrated into daily life.
But it also reveals how heavily China's government has been backing the development of these technologies to close the artificial intelligence gap with the United States. For years, Beijing has been funneling tens of billions of dollars into AI research and state subsidies, like it did with the electric vehicle industry, making all this a very different kind of race.
Videos of robots dancing, punching, and performing have been all over Chinese social media and state TV as the government has deepened its investment here. But the games are the most ambitious promotional push yet that drew a small but curious crowd to watch how next-gen robotics are taking shape. Research published by Morgan Stanley predicts that by 2050, China will have 302.3 million humanoid robots in use, well ahead of the U.S. projection of just 77.7 million. He says when robots like these gain independent thinking and behavior after training, that will be the real AI age. From what we saw here, people are not obsolete quite yet. There were no speed records being set, and many of the athletes, well, they're prone to fizzling and faceplants. Yet it's all wired to the real goal for China, getting ahead in the global race for AI domination, one clunky step at a time. Janice Mackey-Frere, NBC News, Beijing.
Thank you to Janice for that. I am pretty certain I could take one of those robots in a running race. That is a wrap for this, everybody. You can hear much more of our conversation on that Alaska summit between President Trump and President Putin on our podcast called Here's the Scoop. It is available wherever you get your podcasts. But more coverage picks up right now, right here on NBC News Now. We are coming on the air tonight with the world holding its literal breath. Presidents Trump and Putin meeting right now behind closed doors for more than 2 hours after a very warm greeting. What we know about what's happening inside that room and if we'll see them talk in the next hour or so. Plus, what about the people not in that meeting? Ukrainian and European leaders all anxiously awaiting to learn whether the pair will walk away with a ceasefire, closer ties, or just go home empty-handed. We're going to take you live to Ukraine as well. Then back home, Washington, D.C., officials taking the Trump administration to court over the takeover of that city's police department. How they're pushing back as protesters take to the streets of the nation's capital. And hard time for rapper and singer Sean Kingston, sentenced today for more than 3 years in prison. Why the judge may have let Kingston off kind of easy after his convictions for fraud and grand theft. And then in tonight's breakdown, what a tourism slump in a tourism capital means for the entire country. That's later on in the show. Hey everybody, I'm Yasmin, and for Hallie tonight, the world right now is waiting as Presidents Trump and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin meet behind closed doors in Alaska. The meeting going on for more than 2 hours now, a historic summit that could end with peace in Ukraine or nothing at all. As President Trump said late today, if things don't go well, he's not afraid of walking out mid-meeting. But that hasn't happened yet, meaning we could see both men appear on this stage sometime in the next 90 minutes or so for a joint press conference. But this moment is still a major victory for President Putin. It is hard to overstate just how big it is for the Russian president to be invited onto U.S. soil for diplomatic talks. Take a look at this. The red carpet rolled out literally for Putin as the pair shook hands on the tarmac at this military base outside of Anchorage. Then the U.S. giving Putin a show of force with this flyover, 4 fighter jets and a B-2 bomber buzzing by as the leaders walked up to the cameras. But this is the moment that everybody is talking about. It is this unusual move, the pair getting into the beast together to ride to the summit site. Putin choosing this vehicle over his own. He even flashed a smile to the cameras. On the flight over, Trump setting the stage, saying a ceasefire would be the only outcome that he'd be happy with.
I'd like to see a ceasefire. I wouldn't be thrilled if I didn't get it, but everyone says you're not going to get the ceasefire. It'll take place on the second meeting. I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire.
Right now, they could literally be talking about anything. The first indication of how things are going is going to come in the next few hours or so when the President Trump that is supposed to come out for a press conference either with or without Putin. Forward progress, according to President Trump, would also mean Ukrainian President Zelenskyy getting thrown into this mix for a second meeting. We have got this covered around the world. We got Andrea Mitchell with us. We have Elise Labott from the Council on Foreign Relations here. Richard Engel is with us from Ukraine. We want to start, though, with Monica Alba, who is on the ground for us at this summit site. President Trump said in the lead up to this, Monica, that he would walk out within minutes if it wasn't going well. These men have now been meeting for over 2 hours now. Any indication as to where this thing is going?
Well, look, Yasmin, I just checked in with a couple of sources a few minutes ago, and that was the indication that this 3-on-3 meeting where President Trump is joined by his Secretary of State and his special envoy is still going. Now, remember, they did have about 10 minutes in the presidential limousine from the tarmac to this initial meeting. Add to that this indication of 2 hours, maybe a little bit longer. These two have now been together for an extended amount of time, and it was President Trump who said yesterday he would know within minutes whether this was going to be a, quote, good meeting or a bad meeting. So we haven't gotten any indication other than the fact that this is still going, and there's still a lot that is on the agenda, and we expect after this initial meeting wraps up, Yasmin, they'll go into an extended bilateral conversation with other top aides, and that could go on even longer because there are more players in the room and potentially more things on the agenda to discuss. But it's also notable here that the president is talking about today's face-to-face, but also really trying to indicate what could come next and what the next phase would look like if he makes progress here and how that could involve Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Here's how he put it earlier on Air Force One before the meeting started. Listen.
They'll be discussed, but I've got to let Ukraine make that decision. And I think they'll make a proper decision. But I'm not here to negotiate for Ukraine. I'm here to get them at a table.
And remember, the president had said that the easiest scenario for this would be just to invite Zelenskyy here once talks wrapped up if they went well. Again, we're not sure if that's going to happen. That seems like it would be pretty difficult. But the president said that in terms of territorial swaps, he had indicated to European leaders he wasn't going to be discussing that with President Putin today. Then today he said, well, it might come up, but as you heard in that soundbite, he said we won't make decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine.
So I mentioned in the lead up that if in fact this goes well, President Trump has indicated he wants Zelenskyy, Putin, and himself all in the same room for the second meeting. Do we have any indication out of the White House about how this would actually work? A possible location, a fair territory, a fair place in which this meeting would happen, when it would happen?
No, and those are really obviously the key issues that we're checking on here. We know the president had said there were a possibility, there was a likelihood of 3 locations that the U.S. was potentially evaluating for this kind of a trilateral meeting. But again, the president said the easiest thing would be to just do it here in Alaska to extend this day of talks. It's, again, unclear whether somehow that's part of what's being discussed and if there's any movement on that front. That'll be one of the key questions to the president, who I do believe will take questions. He said even if things don't go in the direction he wants, he says he would do his own news conference. But if things are headed in the direction that he feels is positive, there will be that joint news conference with President Putin to wrap this all up. Yasmin.
Monica Alba for us. Thank you. Stay close to that camera. We appreciate you. I want to talk to Richard Engel now, who's standing by for us inside Ukraine. Richard, as I was watching President Trump greet President Putin, I can't help but think about this split-screen moment in which he met with President Zelenskyy months ago and was treated versus how the Russian president is being treated so far in the lead up to this meeting.
Well, lots of Ukrainians noticed that as well. And Ukrainian media, state television here, has been reporting, all the news channels anyway, have been reporting wall to wall on this summit. And they've been watching it. Many of the commentators have been saying how the two leaders, President Trump and Vladimir Putin, appeared to have a friendly greeting, that it was a warm reception. And of course, that is not what happened when President Zelenskyy visited the White House, when he was humiliated. He was embarrassed. The meeting was cut short. He was effectively kicked out of the White House after he was confronted about not wearing a suit, and why hadn't he said thank you. Many different, a very different reception. So that was clear to Ukrainians. But in general, I think Ukrainians are watching this not just offended that President Putin was treated better than their president. I think they could get over that. There's a much deeper concern here, Yasmin. And the deeper concern is that decisions about this country's future, about its borders, about its population, about which cities Ukraine gets to hold on to and which cities are forced to be ceded to Vladimir Putin, who invaded this country 3.5 years ago, that these fundamental decisions are being made about Ukraine without Ukraine. So, yes, people are somewhat annoyed and watching with curiosity at the red carpet reception versus the humiliation that Zelenskyy received. But there's a much more profound trepidation that deals are happening, that hours and hours are going by behind closed doors. President Trump said that he's not going to talk about territory. But at the end of the day, this entire conflict is only about territory. Russia invaded, Vladimir Putin invaded. He said that Ukraine shouldn't exist, that Ukraine is part of Russia, has always been part of Russia. He tried to take over all of the country, failed at that, has been holding on to 20% of this country. And now Ukrainians are asking, will President Trump give Vladimir Putin what he wants, which is to hold on forever for that last 20% in exchange for a ceasefire, which would effectively just be Putin saying that he's going to stop his attacks, because Putin is launching attacks against Ukraine every single day. For Russia, this is a war of choice. Putin can stop, but for Ukraine, if they stop fighting, they lose their country.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Richard, because people are dying today inside Ukraine amidst this ongoing negotiation.
Absolutely. Russia is in the midst of a summer offensive that has been intensifying for the last month or so. There have been drone attacks. There have been evacuation orders. Just earlier today, I was in the city of Kramatorsk, and there has been an evacuation order for the surrounding towns and villages for families with children to get out of town, because of an ongoing Russian offensive. That's happening right now it was happening this morning on the eve of these talks, and Ukrainians believe that is very revealing, that the Russians are going in fighting, and they don't believe that Vladimir Putin has any intention of stopping this war or giving up his interest in controlling Ukraine. You talked about the ongoing offensive. The other day, day before yesterday, it's now past midnight here, so about less than 48 hours ago, we went to a funeral for a Ukrainian soldier. This was a Ukrainian who was a lawyer. He was killed. He was drafted. He was killed in combat. He was hit by a Russian artillery shell. In fact, his body was so badly damaged, it took a long time to conduct DNA analysis to even figure out that they had the right remains. So a horrific death. He leaves behind 2 children, one under 1 year old. And I spoke to his brother, and we went to the funeral, and I asked his brother, who was speaking for all of the mourners, the members of his unit, other members of his family, the mother who was in very difficult shape, very distraught for obvious reasons. And I asked him, do you think that it's necessary for Ukraine to give up some of the land that it has not been able to take back by force, to give back some or all of this 20% that Ukraine has not been able to liberate on its own? And this is what he said. I think we have that clip lined up.
Russia will ask for a little piece of land, he says. The next day, they'll try to take Kyiv. We don't have to compromise with the enemy and give up our beloved land, because this enemy won't stop and will return even stronger.
So you actually heard 2 people were there, back-to-back clips, but they're both expressing the same sentiment. They don't believe, Ukrainians, and this is not just these 2 people, we've been hearing this from government officials, from soldiers, from civilians. Ukrainians don't believe that just giving land to Vladimir Putin, rewarding him, letting him keep what he captured by force, in which the Ukrainians have been unable to take back, will appease Vladimir Putin, that it will satisfy his hunger, that he will just keep coming back for more and more. And that's why they're deeply concerned about what's happening in this very long series of meetings in Alaska right now, that they're not invited to.
Richard Engel, I'm going to ask you to stay close to your camera as things are developing there. For now, my friend, we appreciate you. I want to bring in our own Andrea Mitchell and Elise Labott as well. Elise is an Edward R. Murrell Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of Cosmopolitics on Substack. Andrea, I want to start with you because I want to pick up on where Richard left off, which is this idea in which some Ukrainians feel as if they just have to keep fighting because if they relent or cede any more land, Putin will just want to continue to take more, right? And that is really kind of the overarching fear for many Europeans, hence why they had that Zoom call with the president before this meeting in Alaska. But then how does this thing end? Because Putin wants to walk away as a winner, right? And his main objective, of course, is in fact that territory. And I'm asking you, Andrea, of course, as we're watching this this location in which the press conference will in fact take place, if in fact the president will be there alongside Russian President Vladimir Putin. We don't know when this will happen and or if they will be standing there together, but that is in fact where they're happening. And we're seeing more action inside that room than we have seen over the last few hours or so, Andrea.
Well, as you know, it's gone on, this meeting, which was attended also by 2 advisors on each side, 3 on 3, if you will, has gone on for quite a long time. It was supposed to be an expanded lunch, so we don't know whether that larger meeting is going to take place or when it's going to take place or when this news conference would presumably take place, if it does include both of the leaders. And then if Vladimir Putin will take questions, which he has in the past. He did certainly at our meeting, the meeting that he had with President Biden in Geneva. And he took lots of questions from the foreign press. And of course, Keir Simmons, our colleague, has had questions to him at various times at those annual briefings that he does for the foreign press. But what Richard Engel was describing is the ground truth from Ukraine. He referred to the coverage, his reporting on that extraordinary funeral just the day before yesterday. The emotion of that and the visuals of that is just a microcosm, of course, of the thousands and thousands of families in Ukraine and on the Russian side who have been impacted by this horrible war. And it just is very striking that for all of the irritation that President Trump has expressed in recent weeks, he has never acknowledged that Russia invaded. And in fact, last Monday, was notably more terse about Zelenskyy than about Vladimir Putin, despite all of the negative things that he had said about Putin and being disappointed in him. So it remains to be seen whether the chumminess of their greeting is actually reflected in their talks.
Elise, I think it's important to kind of reset where we are in this thing as we are, you know, awaiting any news out of this ongoing negotiation between President Trump and President Putin. Because inside that room, of course, we know Foreign Minister Lavrov, I believe, is alongside Russian President Vladimir Putin. On the U.S. side, we have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who spoke with President Putin and met with him, I believe it was last week, alongside, of course, President Donald Trump. And the juxtaposition of that picture to what we saw in Helsinki in President Trump's first term, in which he met one-on-one with President Putin. Right. Talk about the stakes here and how this is different than what we had seen last time around, the possibility of what might come from this, considering, of course, the accountability of the individuals that are in the room with him.
Right. Well, I think the stakes, Yasmin, are even higher this time. Before, there was a lot of talk about the relationship between Russia and the U.S. and President Trump and Putin and the backdrop of the elections. But President Trump has really staked his reputation, his self-proclaimed reputation as a deal maker on the line here. So as much as Ukraine or the future of the West or transatlantic security, I can't say President Trump really cares much about that, but he does care about his own legacy. And I think he does want peace between Russia and Ukraine. You see in various conflicts, he does, when he sees a lot of people are being killed, that's what drives him to act. And so people on both sides, Russian soldiers, Ukrainians, are being killed, and he does talk about that. And I think President Trump learned from that moment, and that's why in the last few weeks, there was some confusion, I think, about what Steve Witkoff heard and communicated to President Trump when he met with President Putin. President Trump, my understanding over the last week or so, has been reaching out to a lot more experts, trying to get a better sense of what they think is possible, what they think he should do. And he is speaking with the Europeans. He spoke with President Zelenskyy, and you see his rhetoric changing a little bit. Of course, it remains to be seen what happens in the room when President Putin has his charm offensive. But I think that's why it's so important that Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff are in the room. He's fortified with people that are going to be able to give him more ability to fight back or talk back. And he does seem to have more confidence.
Elise, Andrea, if you would stand by, I want to bring in Monica Alba for us once again, as we're seeing kind of more action in this room now on our screens. Monica, what are you hearing?
Well, look, Yasmin, when we're talking about the way we thought this day would unfold, we've said it all day long. Things were still up in the air even before the presidents arrived here in Alaska. They were working out the details of how this all would go as they were landing, as we all saw when they got into the presidential limousine together and rode for about 10 minutes from the tarmac to the first meeting site. That was something that we didn't know was going to happen. And now perhaps something next that is also a little bit unscheduled or unexpected. It all depends. But we are told that it's possible this press conference could take place next. But will it just be President Trump? Unknown. Would it be Presidents Trump and Putin together? We're still waiting to get word on that. But what would be potentially notable here, Yasmin, is the idea that this 3-on-3 meeting, the one that included Presidents Trump and Putin and their two top aides, that's been going on now for almost 3 hours. We are nearing that mark. I just looked down to check at my phone. It would be about 3 hours, 10 minutes from now. And again, add those 10 minutes from the presidential limousine. These two leaders have been together now for more than 3 hours total. And so if they were to go to the press conference, or if just President Trump is going to hold a press conference next, that would mean that this next session, which was going to be an expanded bilateral working lunch where the delegations would come together and have a larger discussion, again, with more people in the room, like the president's Commerce Secretary, Treasury Secretary, and his Chief of Staff. and his defense secretary as well, I might add, who we haven't talked as much about going into this, then if that's scrapped entirely, what does that mean? So we don't know yet. I've just checked in with another source, and I'm told that there is no update, that they were still in that meeting as of a couple of minutes ago. So that is a really significant development here if somehow this next phase is being scrapped. But it's too soon to say, Yasmin, what that really means.
Monica, if there is some success out of this thing and they are able to move on to a trial with President Zelenskyy as well, is there any possibility there would be other folks that, in fact, would be joining here? Because as I've been talking and thinking about this, I wonder if President Trump, in fact, will be the sole arbiter in the negotiations between President Zelenskyy and President Putin. But, of course, we'll talk more about that coming up. Want to pause now for an NBC News special report.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Tom Yamas.
And good evening. We are coming on the air with a lot of breaking news right now on a historic day here in Alaska. Any moment now, President Trump is set to speak at a news conference after he met face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin about the future of the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin has said that their negotiations have wrapped up, and they said Vladimir Putin will appear with President Trump at the news conference we are expecting at any moment there on the left hand of your screen. Both world leaders shaking hands during a red carpet welcome earlier at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. Putin was seen smiling while hitching a ride with President Trump. That moment followed by a high-stakes meeting between the U.S. and Russian delegations. It comes as President Trump tries to reach a ceasefire and a peace deal that could end the 3 years of fighting and all of that killing in Ukraine. I want to get straight to our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, who was there at that news conference. Peter, the schedule changed pretty dramatically. What do we know at this hour?
Yeah. Tom, that's exactly right. We are inside the room, just about 100 to 200 feet away from where the delegations had been meeting for most of the last 2 to 2.5 hours. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin not holding a one-on-one, absent the time they spent together in the presidential limousine, but they're joined by, on the U.S. side, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as well as the Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, and alongside Vladimir Putin, some of his top advisors as well. It was our expectation that there would be an expanded meeting where the delegations would bring in additional advisors over lunch to gather. It's not clear whether that took place, but what is clear is that we do expect to hear from both President Trump and Vladimir Putin very shortly here on Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. This was a stunning turn of events. This was not how we anticipated. The expectation was this could go on for quite some time. The president has detailed what his expectation was coming into the day when he was on Air Force One shortly after departing Washington, D.C. He said he was hoping to come away with a ceasefire, and that in his words, he would not be happy if that didn't happen today. The president has also said in recent days, Tom, that he would be willing to leave, in effect. First, he said he would know after the first couple of minutes of his meeting with Vladimir Putin whether Putin was open to a deal, a ceasefire or a wider peace deal. And he said that if things went south, in effect, that they went sideways, that he was very willing to walk away, that there wouldn't be a joint news conference, that he would take some questions and immediately head home. So at least by his own standard, by that metric, it appears that some progress was made. In exactly what form, we wait to see. Certainly a lot of questions for Vladimir Putin as we reach now 3.5 years into this awful war. And there have been so many eyes focused on this in anticipation with the relentless bombardment of Ukraine continuing by the Russians. Vladimir Putin, among the questions today will be Donald Trump has had a complicated relationship with Putin dating back to Helsinki in 2018, where the two held a joint news conference. And at that time, Donald Trump, in effect, sided with Vladimir Putin as it related to Russian interference in the 2016 election over the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. But more recently, the president has been much more critical of Putin, saying, in effect, that when they speak, Putin is quite nice, but it turns out as he watches, the president watches more headlines of more attacks killing soldiers and civilians alike, that Putin's words are meaningless. So among the questions we'll be looking to ask today, why Donald Trump can trust Vladimir Putin, that he would not continue with this invasion if an agreement is reached here. But the bottom line is we do anticipate much earlier than initially expected to hear from both President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin just moments from now. Tom.
Peter, take our viewers into what you think may be happening right now. And of course, a lot of this is fluid. There's a lot we don't know at this hour. We're going to learn in a few moments as soon as those two world leaders take to that stage. But you've covered a lot of these bilateral meetings. We saw the schedule today. What stands out to me is that this was going to be the last event for the day before Vladimir Putin jumps back on his jet and heads to Moscow and President Trump heads back to Washington, D.C. Having covered a lot of these meetings, what can we read from these tea leaves? Again, the Russians earlier today said this meeting could last 5 to 7 hours. We're about less than 3 on our clock right now. What can we sort of glean from that?
You know, Tom, it's a good question. I think that's what all of us are waiting to see the answer to. I will say that the images we've seen already today were not only historic, they were also striking, and certainly in the eyes of some of the presidents, President Putin and President Trump's critics, I think they may have been startling to see Vladimir Putin in the back of the presidential limousine where he was chuckling, laughing, smiling. The two of them, though there wasn't a one-on-one, in effect had a one-on-one privately with what we believe were no interpreters in the vehicle at that time. So what were they speaking about during that short visit? But recognize, I think, as we anticipate this dramatic moment here, that Donald Trump, throughout dating back to his time as a businessman successfully in New York, as a television producer, really is the producer of this presidency. And we watched it play out in real time a bit earlier today as the two men, at almost at the exact time, descended the staircases from their aircraft. They walked down that red carpet, shaking hands, as Russian media noted, for about 15 minutes in total, 15 seconds, excuse me, in total. Donald Trump patting Putin's hand as they shook, the two sharing smiles and brief exchanges before they walked up on top of that platform where they were framed by American fighter jets, a U.S. warplane surrounded by other fighter jets flying overhead, ultimately before they entered the beast, the presidential limousine. So a lot of this choreography appears to be that Donald Trump has become so known for. The one thing we don't know is what happened in those private moments that the two shared, not only in the beast, but behind closed doors here as well.
We thank you for that, Peter. Stand by for us. If you're just joining our coverage right now, we are waiting at any moment for both President Trump and Vladimir Putin to take the stage there at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and start their news conference and possibly take questions. We are live all over the world tonight for this historic moment. I want to go live to Ukraine right now as we await the two leaders. Richard Engel is there. And Richard, you heard Peter's reporting. We saw all those images today, including that image of Vladimir Putin in the back of the beast, smiling and waving. And already those images and the warm welcome he got here in Alaska is being broadcast throughout Ukraine.
Oh, 100%. The state television here and all of the news channels in this country are covering this wall to wall. And they've been highlighting the fact that President Trump greeted Vladimir Putin warmly, that they shook hands, all the things that you and Peter were just talking about. And they also, it wasn't lost on anyone here, they also noticed how different that was to when Vladimir Putin visited the White House earlier this year and got questioned about why he didn't wear a suit, and that visit ended early, and many felt that Zelenskyy was bullied by President Trump and his inner circle. But aside from being somewhat curious about the different receptions and maybe even a little bit offended, Ukrainians' concerns about what is happening right now in Alaska go far deeper than the different kinds of greetings that President Trump has given to Vladimir Putin or President Zelenskyy. They're much more concerned in this country about the long-term consequences, much more concerned about what's going to be said in the next few minutes. Because these two leaders are coming out to the podium, does suggest that they have reached some sort of agreement, that they have something to announce. This country's future could depend on what they announce in the next few minutes. And that is much more concerning to Ukrainians than who got a better handshake or who got a better ride in the back of the limo. Russia currently occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory. And Ukrainians are concerned that in a peace deal, Russia could get to keep some or all of that territory permanently, or at least in a medium term, redrawing Ukraine's borders and transferring population.
All right, Richard, stand by for us. I know you're going to want to hear what's in this news conference as well. I also want to bring in Yeah, I also want to bring in Keir Simmons, who has been covering Russia for years for us, one of the last Western journalists to interview Vladimir Putin. Before we get right to Keir, I do want to say it's 6:30 p.m. on the East Coast and it's 2:30 p.m. here in Alaska, where at any moment President Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin are set to hold a joint news conference after a nearly 3-hour meeting with the goal of paving the way to a potential ceasefire in Ukraine. Again, at any moment, we're expecting both world leaders to walk out there and potentially take questions about what was learned, what was discussed, and hopefully if there's any progress towards peace in Ukraine. I do want to go to Keir Simmons. Keir, I know you've been listening to all the reporting. You've seen the messages out of the Kremlin. This meeting ending earlier than the Russians initially had stated it would go. Some parts of the schedule are no longer on the schedule. This was supposed to be the last event that was supposed to take place in about an hour. It's taking place now. What, if anything, does this tell us, having studied and covered the Russians for so long?
Well, I think President Trump and President Putin clearly have agreed something, or at least have agreed that it is safe, if you like, for the two of them to stand together. Those images you're looking at, to stand together in front of the world's media and take questions. How many questions will they take? How long will it last? All of those things we wait to see. I will say we have been here before, Tom. In Helsinki, we watched President Trump and President Putin hold a news conference. We know that President Trump likes the spectacle of it, likes the to and fro of it, and often can seem to be making policy in real time as he takes questions from journalists. Will he do that again here? In Helsinki, he was criticized hugely by many for giving too much to President Putin. Will this be different? Certainly, the bonhomie between the two leaders at the beginning of this, two hours ago, suggests that they got along well, and suggests that what you're going to see in the coming minutes are two leaders, ostensibly adversaries, who like each other and think that they can do some kind of a deal with each other. Why would they be walking out together this way unless that was the case? And we are hearing, Tom, reports from Russia that there are members of the Russian delegation sitting in the front row at that news conference, waiting to hear from President Putin themselves. A counterpoint to that, I would say, is that the meeting that we just have been waiting to finish was a meeting between Russian and U.S. diplomats. The economic advisors, the trade advisors weren't in the room. Secretary of State Rubio, for example, Foreign Minister Lavrov were there. Both Foreign Minister Lavrov and another of President Putin's officials speak fluent English, so that may have helped the conversation move at a pace. That being said, we do know President Putin often can be quite verbose, can have a lot to say. So what have they managed to do in 2 hours? I mean, all of these questions, we're just going to have to wait to see what the two presidents have to say when they walk out. It does look like at any moment.
All right, Keir Simmons, again, if you're just joining our special coverage here, we are waiting at any moment for President Trump and Vladimir Putin to take the stage there at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. You can see the backdrop and that banner, pursuing peace. The goal here for President Trump, he laid it out today. He would like a ceasefire agreement to come out of this meeting. On top of that, he would also like a second meeting, possibly a trilateral meeting, including the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. I want to bring in the moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker. Kristen, throughout the week, the White House had sort of downplayed expectations. They had lowered the bar, calling this a listening exercise, saying basically they just wanted to set the table for a future meeting. But today, President Trump set some goalposts, saying he does want a ceasefire, saying he does want a second meeting. In a short time, we're going to find out if that's a reality.
Tom, you're absolutely right. And that goalpost, I can tell you, in talking to European and Ukrainian officials throughout the course of this week, has been set by them, saying that basically a victory for President Trump would require him to walk away with an unconditional ceasefire. That word unconditional, hugely significant, Tom. They say if there are strings attached, that would be a victory for President Putin. So in talking to my sources right now, the reaction, one of waiting, watching to see what these two leaders have to say. Is this announcement one of process, or is there a real agreement that has been reached? Will there be a second meeting? And of course, the big question looming over all of this, does President Trump acknowledge that it is President Putin who is the aggressor in this case? That is what Democratic sources say they would like to hear from this president. This is, of course, a conflict that has divided the Republican Party. Some 51% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the war in Ukraine. Remember, he promised to end this in 24 hours of being elected. He has acknowledged it's proven more difficult than even he anticipated. So this is one of the biggest tests of his second term, Tom.
Christian, stand by for us. We are getting some new reporting. This coming from the Kremlin. The Kremlin announcing this in Russia, that the news conference of the president of Russia and the U.S. will begin shortly. I want to go back to Peter Alexander. We see him there in the screen in front of the two podiums there. Peter, my question to you, I know you have trouble hearing because it's loud there. Do we know if the American press will be allowed to ask questions at this news conference?
Tom, it's a good question. We don't have an answer to that one yet. In fact, this came together very quickly. We did anticipate a news conference. It wasn't clear that both presidents would be here, though that was the initial expectation. Now the Kremlin has announced that Vladimir Putin will be here alongside Donald Trump. I was just speaking to some of the top White House advisors if they could give us any timing on this, any more specifics. They basically said, just wait. A Russian advisor to the president moments ago telling reporters, when asked what happened behind closed doors, he said, you'll have to wait to hear for yourself. So there is certainly a lot of anticipation about the way that this is going to play out right now. One in particular occurred there, whether they were able to come to some agreement on a ceasefire, whether the topic of, in the words of the president, divvying up Ukraine did come up, even though European allies and Ukraine itself have urged President Trump not to discuss that very topic without Ukraine in the room. So, in effect, we are right now in what Donald Trump, in TV terms, would describe as a cliffhanger. We wait to see exactly what happened here, specifically as it relates to those meetings. And certainly, as we've been listening to a lot of the Russian reporters here, including those from state television, they view this perhaps in much wider terms, beyond just the topics of a ceasefire, a potential peace deal as it related to Ukraine. They view this more broadly as an opportunity to restore a strained relationship between the United States and Russia, between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin themselves. So we will anticipate with you what happens, and we'll certainly have a lot of questions we want to ask both presidents. Whether we get that opportunity remains to be seen.
Peter, before you go, because we can see from the wide pool shot where you're standing right now, you seem to be kind of close to the front row, at least from where we're looking. Can you see which members of the Trump administration or cabinet members are already there, and or the Russians, or have they not arrived just yet?
Yeah, there are members of both delegations here. They're seated in the first rows on each side. Some members of the Russian delegation and of the American delegation. Notably, none of those individuals who were inside the early meeting that took place today, lasting more than 2.5 hours, are present for the U.S. That's the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio, the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. They are not here as well. The expanded bilateral meeting, what was supposed to take place over lunch, was to include some of the top advisors economically for the president. The Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent. Howard Lutnick is the Commerce Secretary. They were among those who were expected to be in attendance. But to this point, we don't know whether there was in some form an abbreviated expanded bilateral, or if they're just coming from what was a 3-on-3 meeting with their interpreters before arriving here. Tom, to pull back the curtain a little bit, this has been a remarkable day. In more than 13 years of covering the White House, I have not seen security like that which we have witnessed here today, as the American and Russian reporters were welcomed onto Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. They each went through separate, in effect, vetting, where they were swept to check for any equipment that wasn't allowed to be brought in, any weapons or anything of that kind. And one of the Secret Service officers heading up that process said to me that this was a much more meticulous process than you normally see. So meticulous that as we waited on buses to enter, there were literally Secret Service agents who were opening up each of the pre-prepared lunch boxes boxes, breakfast boxes that were being brought in for those individuals who would be inside here just to check them so that nothing was snuck onto the property here before today's meeting take place. If we look around this room, I would tell you there's probably a couple hundred individuals here, certainly a full contingent of reporters who cover the White House, the president, on a daily basis. There are dozens of Russian reporters as well, but there are also reporters from all across the world, all of whom obviously would be impacted by the potential of any agreement of any kind as it relates to this 3.5-year relentless war after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Tom?
And I do want to ask you about the reporters in the room, Peter, because explain to our viewers here, are most of the people that are in that room reporters? And how, in a news conference like this, a bilateral news conference, will people get to ask questions if it's opened up to questions, right? Because any reporter on any part of this globe would want to be in there right now asking those two men questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that every reporter that I'm seated around certainly has questions prepared. I'm sure there'll be a cacophony of voices as they all try to get heard by the president here, trying to get his attention. President Trump, when he holds news conferences regularly, does it a bit differently than past presidents, where he just sort of picks and chooses and calls on individuals as he likes. Whether or not there are some predetermined individuals who will be asking questions on either side, we don't know that right now. Traditionally, there are some opening statements, and I think that's where we will all be listening very closely to get a better understanding of what, if anything, was agreed to, what came of this private conversation, what it means to Ukraine. If the president has already had any conversation, any outreach to the Ukrainian president about the conversation here. He has said that his desire was, and he said it would be easiest if they just extended this meeting into some meetings in the days ahead that could also take place here in Alaska with President Zelenskyy in attendance. Is there any chance that that would take place right now? So there's just so many topics and so many questions, not the least of which relates to the killing, the deaths that have taken place across Ukraine over the course of this 40-plus months. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, certainly tens of thousands in Ukraine alone, where, as our colleague Richard Engel witnessed yesterday, there was another burial of multiple individuals drafted into the war. And the question is really, will Vladimir Putin stop his assault on Ukraine right now and accept Ukraine as an independent, sovereign neighbor next door?
Yeah, we hope to hear what they have to say. And again, at any moment, we're expecting both leaders to come out. Garrett Haake joins us now. Garrett, we were talking earlier that for the president to come out here, announce this news conference, to have that banner pursuing peace like we see it here, the entire world watching, they've notified everyone that this is going to happen at any moment. Yep. People are hoping, especially in Ukraine, that there is some progress to come out here and not have, they would set all this up and have nothing to show for it, even though the schedule has changed.
Yeah, look, I mean, we talk about these summits as typically highly choreographed affairs. This has clearly become improv at this point. The lunch that we expected to happen between the broader delegations has gone away. There were elements to this that we had been told would not occur, that have occurred. This press conference happening much earlier than we've expected. So I don't want to lean too heavily on precedent here, but despite the best efforts of the White House to lower expectations about this meeting today, they got ratcheted back up by the president's comments on Air Force One, suggesting he'd be very upset if there wasn't a ceasefire to announce today, and by the stagecraft of this event. This is not some small meeting to set up a larger meeting, Tom. This is very clearly something that has been amped up by the president. The fact that Vladimir Putin is still here, that there are two podiums, that they're coming out, does suggest there's some positive development. I want to key in on something that Peter said, because I think this could be the delay that we're in right now. The president said earlier in this week that Zelenskyy would be among the first people he would tell if there was news out of this. That could very well be what's responsible for this delay right now.
Yeah, the president could be calling the leader of Ukraine, who is right now fighting a war, a wartime president, to let him know of any developments. I do want to bring in the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who has a tremendous amount of experience in bilateral meetings, in meeting foreign dignitaries, including Vladimir Putin. Ambassador McFaul, what do you make of what we've seen so far? We were told possibly the meeting could be up to 7 hours long. It was less than 3 hours. We're awaiting this news conference. I know it's all speculation at this point, but what do you think's happening behind closed doors?
Well, I'm just speculating, but I have been in these meetings with Vladimir Putin and President Obama. Sometimes the small group meeting goes longer. So the one that they just had goes so long that the larger meeting with the full delegation gets squeezed and maybe in this case canceled altogether. So that could be happening. I know the people in that delegation. I see the Russian delegation right now. I see Kirill Dmitriev's head. He is sitting right in the front row, and that suggests to me that the press conference is going to happen before lunch or there's no lunch because he was supposed to be one of the delegates in the wider meeting. But whether that means a bad outcome or a good outcome, I just think we're just going to have to wait and see what the two presidents say. The fact that President Putin will be at the meeting suggests that there should be some positive news.
Ambassador McFaul, I'm going to tell you, it looks like we have Steve Witkoff, special envoy, who's done a lot of the negotiations with Vladimir Putin. He actually had the meeting that was the meeting before this one that essentially set the table so this could happen here in Alaska on U.S. soil. It looks like other members of the cabinet are going to be making their way inside right now. Ambassador McFaul, what is a victory for the United States, but maybe more importantly for Ukraine to come out of this meeting?
Well, I'm glad you phrased it that way, because summits are supposed to be about what's good for us, the American people, not what's good for Putin or Trump individually. And I think the way we should measure success are our American security interests advanced as a result of this meeting. And in my view, we have a security interest in preventing Putin from dominating and annexing territory in Ukraine. So that's what I'm going to be focused on. Have the president advance that ball, because he put a lot of work into this meeting. I mean, literally a red carpet for an imperial dictator who has, not since Hitler or Stalin have we had a leader to launch a war in Europe of this magnitude, with this level of annexation, with this level of killing. So we better get something out of it.
You know, earlier in the week, European allies, along with Ukraine's president, said that President Trump had told them on a conference call that there'd be serious consequences if there wasn't a ceasefire. Today on Air Force One, President Trump was asked what he meant by that. He said economic consequences. We know that for Putin, he hasn't gotten as much ground. He hasn't gained as much ground in Ukraine this summer. We also know that President Trump has put the pressure on India, 50% tariffs because they buy Russian oil. Russia is struggling financially. Oil funds that war machine in Russia. What could the United States offer to Russia right now? Because there's not a lot of trade that happens between both countries because of the sanctions put in place by President Biden when Ukraine was invaded. But what can the U.S. offer Russia right now, you think?
Well, first, I'd say President Trump has threatened sanctions, and he's been tough rhetorically, but he actually hasn't implemented tough sanctions. Even the Indian sanctions, he hasn't implemented yet. And I think President Putin just keeps calling his bluff. If he wanted to get tough, if he wanted to signal that he was going to be more coercive, which in my opinion he should have done before the summit, not after, there are three things he could do. One, he could seize Russian assets, billions of dollars of Russian central bank assets that are sitting in America. He could do that. Two, he could sanction all of the ships of what they call the shadow fleet that ships that oil out of Russia. Right now, we haven't done that. And three, he could sanction all of the Russian banks that provide the services to allow those exports to happen. He could literally do that on Monday if he wanted to show Putin that he was serious.
And you think from the delegation that the Russians brought here, you know, investment advisors, finance ministers, you think what Russia wanted to do here in Alaska was talk business, where President Trump wanted to talk a lot about Ukraine?
Well, most certainly that's what the delegation suggests. I know every single member of that delegation, by the way. I even know the translator. These people have been at this job for a long time. And without question, when you have the head of the Russian investment fund at the meeting, you're there to talk about business deals. Notably, the negotiator on the Russian side with the Ukrainians, his name is Medinsky, the person that's in charge of trying to negotiate an end to the war with the Ukrainians, they've met from time to time in Turkey, was not part of the delegation. And that suggests that Putin wanted this to be about U.S.-Russian relations, with Ukraine just being a part of it. It looks like, if they're not having that bigger meeting, that it was just about Ukraine. And I think that that's proper. I don't think there's any sense in talking about investment deals and trade until this war ends.
Ambassador McFaul, stand by for us. I know we're going to want to talk to you right after this news conference wraps. Kristen Welker, the moderator of Meet the Press, joins us now. Kristen, a lot on the table for President Trump. He promised to stop this war. His first day in office, we are more than 200 days in. That timeline has definitely been stretched. He says that he didn't mean that seriously, but, you know, he did say that on the campaign trail. We also know that his polling is in the 40s when it comes to his handling of the war in Ukraine. That's what Americans have been saying in two separate polls. And then we also know from reporting he hopes to win a Nobel Peace Prize at some point. And he may very well if he can establish peace in Ukraine. A major moment for the president along the lines that the most important thing here is to end the war in Ukraine.
Well, Tom, absolutely. And President Trump hasn't shied away from talking about that Nobel Peace Prize. As we all know, one of his biggest rivals, former President Barack Obama, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. Tom, notably, another rival of his, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, made headlines by saying, look, if President Trump can end this war and give Ukraine back all of its territory, she would personally nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, of course, that's all but impossible because territory is really what is at stake here, Tom. But it does underscore the backdrop, the political backdrop to all of this. As you say, his polling underwater, a slim margin, 51% of Americans say they disapprove of his handling of the war in Ukraine. So there's an immense amount of pressure for him to get this resolved. The Republican Party leading the charge, saying that the United States should no longer have to fund the war in Ukraine, send weapons to Ukraine. So that is part of the pressure that he is getting as well. And among the questions, he was in the room there, Tom, with a former KGB official trying to hammer out the terms of what, as he said, he hopes would be a ceasefire agreement. And so one of the concerns with his European counterparts was that President Putin would try to change the subject, would try to shift to his agenda, getting sanctions lifted, for example, trying to get a new nuclear arms deal with the United States. Was President Trump, were his counterparts in the room able to fend off and hold off President Putin's attempts to change the subject, Tom? That's the question.
We're seeing the president's cabinet come in now. We just saw Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Before that, we saw Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov come in and sit down right in the front row. We understand we are less than 2 minutes away from this news conference starting. Again, we were told and given signs about 30, 40 minutes ago it was going to start earlier, but this looks to be the real deal. It looks like the two leaders of Russia and of the United States will be walking out shortly. We also anticipate possibly they will take questions from the scores of journalists that are filling those chairs right now at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. Our reporter, Peter Alexander, is there. The Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, along with Steve Witkoff as well. The envoy who sort of set the table for this meeting has been traveling really around the world to both Israel and trying to establish peace there, but also Russia, somewhat freelancing in the role. It kind of goes wherever the president wants to send him. And the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, his role transforming, spending a lot of time now at the White House as the National Security Advisor. These were the two men that were part of the U.S. bilateral meeting, the initial meeting that was supposed to take place, that we believe did take place. We saw sort of the pool spray, if you will. That's when they give us the first images of those people sitting together. It is unclear what meetings happened after that. We believe it stands to reason that the lunch was scrapped on the schedule because of the timing of all this. It was kind of fast. I mean, it was less than 3 hours. The Russians had talked about possibly 5 to 7 hours. That being said, President Trump can come out here and say they had a wonderful lunch, they had several meetings, and they've made some agreements. But that's the big question. What have they agreed on? What did they come to terms on? And what does it mean for the people of Ukraine who have lost tens of thousands, who are still fighting so bravely, and who have sent their men of all ages to fight against the Russians, whereas the Russians themselves have taken about 20% of Ukraine and have called on North Korea and even their own prisoners to fight this war, even asking North Korea for ammo and weapons as well, as the U.S. has sort of had a back and forth with Ukraine over those weapons as well. No doubt Ukraine could not fight this war without the help of the United States. Kristen, if I still have you here, the relationship between President Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskyy has evolved over the years. It looks like this is about to start. We see President Trump and Vladimir Putin. Let's listen in.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots are buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they have fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And Special Envoy of the President, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kyiv and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there is a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound, and I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelenskyy and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Ratcliffe. Thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think, you know, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all. But we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax. But what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, otherwise, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss. But especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So we have just been watching this news conference between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, and it is strikingly unclear what, if anything, was accomplished here. The president saying there is no deal until there is a deal, saying they have disagreed on some major points, but they've agreed on other points, that he's going to call NATO now. He's going to call President Zelenskyy. But this is quite incredible. Under the banner of pursuing peace here in Alaska on U.S. soil, Vladimir Putin's first trip to the U.S. in nearly a decade, it is unclear what they've accomplished. It is unclear what they've agreed on. And more importantly, it is unclear what this means for the people of Ukraine that are currently fighting a war against Russia that has invaded their territory. Peter Alexander was in that room there. Peter, you know, they were dropping sort of some nuggets here and there, but it's really unclear what they've agreed upon. Putin spoke a lot about a cooperation with the U.S., possibly in trade, in space, in high tech. I mean, a lot of platitudes were discussed, nothing concrete. What is your takeaway from what we just heard there?
Hey, Will, can you hear me?
Well, first of all, this is one of the very few times, Tom, I think we can say States had few words. How many times have we seen him where he took questions for hours and hours today, not taking a single question from reporters in the room, leaving unanswered a series of questions like, is there any ceasefire that was agreed to? It appears clear that there was not, at least from him saying there's no deal until there is a deal. He said there has been significant, as he described it, progress that's been made. A couple things are striking here. You'll remember the president earlier today, as he was departing Washington aboard Air Force One, said he was not going to be happy if there was no ceasefire reached. He would be willing to walk away from this without a news conference and fly back home. Obviously, he stuck around, but it doesn't appear that he came away with what he was hoping to come away with. What is still up in the air is what this means for Ukraine. I was struck by what we heard from Vladimir Putin, who in effect said that they had a series of conversations, and among those things that need to be addressed are the origins of this war, in effect blaming Ukraine for this war. I think most would agree, all should agree, that this was a war started by Russia, but it's unclear if Donald Trump supports the idea of an independent, sovereign Ukraine next door to Russia, why he would trust Vladimir Putin to stop the killing of soldiers and civilians alike. There are so many questions that remain unanswered. It's not just the future of Ukraine that remains up in the air, but ultimately its impact throughout that region. We're going to be working our sources right now. We are told that the reporters who were traveling aboard Air Force One have already been rushed out of the room gathering. That would indicate that they are going to be heading home very soon, that there are no extended conversations to take place later. But honestly, Tom, we've really never seen anything like this from a president who produced much of today's events right now and left with sort of leaving us again with a cliffhanger in effect.
It was interesting. Putin was trying to draw a distinction between the country of Ukraine, which he said is a brotherly nation, even though it's one that he invaded, and Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, where Volodymyr Zelenskyy obviously lives, saying that Kyiv may throw a wrench in these plans. But again, both Putin and Trump talked about some type of plan, some type of deal, yet they offered quite literally zero details. And the president himself, though, at one point saying that thousands of lives will be saved if this deal is accomplished. But again, we have no idea what's going to happen. It sounds like he's going to go to NATO and go into, I guess, the Ukrainian president and maybe talk about the terms of the deal and come back. But it's unclear. I do want to bring in now moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker. Kristen, you've interviewed President Trump several times. You've covered these bilateral meetings just like Peter. You've been in the room. Look, if we start to read what's happened so far, a lot of the meeting was scrapped. It was shorter than we thought it was going to be. There's a news conference. No questions are taken. And now both leaders are on their way back to, Putin's back to Russia, President Trump back to D.C. What can we read from all this?
This is an extraordinary turn of events, Tom. Peter laid it out well. The fact that this feels rushed, the fact that we just heard from both leaders, and yet it's very cloudy in terms of what exactly was discussed, what was accomplished. They offered few, if any, specifics, Tom, and they took no questions. This is a president who relishes taking questions. The Russian president relishes taking questions when he holds his annual news conference that can last for hours on end. So the fact that this was so clipped, the fact that you heard from a somewhat muted President Trump underscores that he is not walking away from the ceasefire with a ceasefire agreement that he was hoping for. Remember, those were the terms that he laid out at the beginning of this day. That was how he was defining victory: an immediate ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire. We did not hear the term ceasefire uttered. We didn't hear any end to the fighting talked about. And that really was the goal to this meeting, and to get a second meeting. Will there be another meeting with President Zelenskyy? I'm starting to get some reaction, Tom. A European source telling me this was a big nothing burger. A Republican ally of President Trump saying it's a very good start, but not providing any details. And a Democratic source saying it's really unclear what exactly happened here. So I think the broad reaction, watching and waiting to see if more details start to emerge, if anything was actually accomplished. And again, that critical question, Tom, will there in fact be another meeting? It seems far off based on the tone. Another meeting that would involve Zelenskyy, but we'll have to see.
Not only that, Christian, I mean, we have to know Putin somewhat made a joke about the second meeting happening in Moscow. So to me, that telegraphs a little bit about the seriousness, or maybe lack thereof, of a second meeting, and that they're not quite there yet. I understand you're hearing from your Republican sources as well about this being a good start. It's sort of hard to understand that, because we don't understand it's the start of. People in the world, Ukraine obviously hoping this was the first step towards a path of peace. But again, it very may will be, but we don't know that quite yet, because we don't understand what he's going to tell NATO and or the Ukrainian president. I do want to go to Richard Engel, who's live tonight for us in Ukraine. Richard, you've been listening to all of this. I'm sure Ukraine, it is very late over there in Ukraine. In the morning, they will wake up to these headlines. But I got to think people in Ukraine are going to be waking up wondering what just happened and what was accomplished.
While this may be unsatisfying, Tom, this was actually very good news for many in Ukraine. Ukrainians have been expressing deep concern that Putin or Trump would come out today and announce a deal, and announce that a ceasefire deal had been reached, or announce that a full agreement had been reached without the Ukrainians in the room. Instead, we saw President Trump acting very cautiously. It didn't look that way initially. I was quite surprised that it was Vladimir Putin who took this podium first, who spoke at length in Russian about history, and he talked about an agreement that had been reached, and he spoke quite clearly that there was a deal, and he was worried that the Europeans or the government in Kyiv, the Ukrainian government, which he attacked, would try and upset the deal, suggesting that a deal was in place and that the Ukrainians weren't going to like it. Then we saw President Trump said, no, we're not done. We're going to speak to NATO. We're going to speak to the Ukrainians first. And until it's done, it's not done. And implied that there's going to be more meetings, and implied that they're working on a deal that could save thousands of lives, i.e. a ceasefire deal. That is exactly the approach that the Europeans, that is exactly the approach that President Zelenskyy had been pushing for. They were telling President Trump just a couple of days ago on this video conference, go slow, don't trust Putin, don't sign any big deals on the spot, wait until we're involved. So while it may be cryptic and unsatisfying, it could have been much worse from Ukraine's perspective had they come out and made an announcement and the Ukrainians were caught surprised on the back foot and then having to digest a deal that they weren't part of.
It's a great observation. Richard, stand by for us. I want to bring in Keir Simmons, who has covered Russia for so many years for us. Keir, you know a lot of those players in the room. You've interviewed Vladimir Putin one-on-one. Talk to me about what you thought about what Putin had said in his remarks. And there was that moment where President Trump was sort of having some fun with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and trying to give the press conference a moment of levity there, with no deal announced. But there may be a deal that we just don't know about that the president is presenting to NATO and the Ukrainian president before he announces to the world. How did you interpret Vladimir Putin's comments?
Yeah, I mean, President Trump was almost trolling Sergei Lavrov, wasn't he? The arch troller-in-chief of Russia. He's so good at it himself. I had to sit there and have President Trump turn the tables on him, in a sense. I thought President Putin's face was interesting after he made his statement. It wasn't the smiles and the laughs that you saw in the beast, in the presidential vehicle on the way to the conversation. I think it's interesting that President Putin had his trade negotiator sitting there in the front row, had flown all that way. And one point to make here, Tom, is, you know, this is the heart of August. This is right in the middle of Russian vacation time. President Putin has pulled all of these Russian officials across the world to do this, and some of the meetings, it appears, haven't happened, and the lunch hasn't happened. To put it another way, this is not Helsinki, which is the famous news conference that President Trump and President Putin last held, where President Putin was hugely criticized for seeming to give President Trump was hugely criticized for seeming to give President Putin all of the running. When we talked before the summit, Tom, we talked about that example of President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un, where it was bonhomie and friendship, but then President Trump walked away. Is that what's happened here? One of the aspects of this that everyone is pointing out, and everybody is right to, is that we need to wait and see what we discover. Both sides, and by that I mean both the US, the Trump administration, and the Russians will be spinning, heavily spinning in the hours ahead. There are officials on both sides who want to make this look good, be positive, and they will be, the Russians certainly will be out there telling their own journalists and therefore the world what happened here. One other point, though, as a counterpoint really, is of course President Trump did not walk out and say, well, we haven't reached a deal, so therefore tariffs and sanctions, I'm going to impose that 50% sanction on tariff on India. I'm going to double down on support for Ukraine. He didn't say any of that. And just remember that I think just a week ago or so, President Trump had a deadline for President Putin where he said, if you don't agree to a ceasefire, I am going to really punish you. He didn't say that in that meeting, and it may be that in the days ahead, that will be assessed as a win for President Putin, that in a sense, coming to this meeting, having all of these images beamed around the world and walking away without any agreement but without any punishment, that will be assessed as a win. But we really do need to hear the details of what really happened, and neither of those leaders gave us that in that news conference.
Yeah, not even a little bit. All right, Keir, stand by for us. We've just learned that Sergei Lavrov was asked by reporters several questions as he walked by reporters. He didn't answer any of the questions. He just continued on his way. I want to bring in Garrett Haake here. Garrett, listen, President Trump 2.0, this new administration, the second time around, he's learned a lot. You can, whether you like the president or not, he's much more disciplined in a lot of ways. His team's a lot more disciplined. There may very well be a great deal on the table, and they're just staying tight-lipped about it to make sure they have all sides to agree, and they'll announce it at a later date. That's not President Trump's usual style, especially when you have a backdrop like this in the world watching. You want him, he wants to deliver for his audience, but that could be the case.
Look, obviously it's a very complex situation, but I will say it is very unusual that both Vladimir Putin spoke first and for more than twice as long as President Trump did, having the first opportunity to categorize what happened in this meeting, that the president chose to take no questions, though he's expected to give at least one interview tonight, so we may hear from him. And I'm not hearing, and our colleagues I'm in contact with aren't hearing anything from our sources within the administration offering even an early spin on what would make this meeting here today a success. What I'm seeing from some of the MAGA allies of the president, some of his biggest allies on the internet, are tweets about, comments about how Vladimir Putin affirmed that if Trump were president in 2022, this war wouldn't have started in the first place. Tom, that's not what this meeting was about.
No one's having that argument. Now, explain this to our viewers. When you're watching news conferences like this, you're on your phone, you're reaching out to different people in the administration, Republicans, people that are watching, and usually in these situations when things go well, your phone's blowing up with positivity. It's just quiet.
That's right. I mean, the president and his allies are very good at amplifying his message, and usually there's a pretty clear, it's usually pretty easy to tell what the message is that they want to be the key takeaway if they feel like something has been a success. That they are so quiet in this instance could be surprising given the overall sensitivity of this, but when you consider how many people were in the room, this 3-on-3 versus a 1-on-1, and the fact that so many officials were here preparing for such bigger meetings, this seems like a disappointment on its face. Again, I don't want to prejudge it, but there's no one out here claiming that this was a victory. There was a lot of hype about this being an historic meeting, and other than the pictures, which will live forever on this, it's not at all clear what was achieved, if anything.
Because we talk about the Russian delegation. You had finance ministers here, you had investment envoys here, you had defense ministers. I mean, the Russians brought their team to Alaska, and it's unclear why these meetings ended so early. They didn't address that in the news conference. Peter Alexander is still there. He was witnessing this up close, just steps away from that podium. Peter, have we gotten any more information on the two countries? We've been waiting to hear those jets roar and take off over our heads as either Vladimir Putin heads back to Russia or the president heads back to D.C. Do we know anything more about the schedule? And is this summit essentially over?
It's a good question. We have no indication that there are any additional meetings taking place here, though I haven't heard the roar of either engine. They were parked on tarmacs not far from us right now. Tom, I'm struck by a couple of, as the president prepares to leave here in Alaska. First, his desire, of course, that this would be an extended trip where Volodymyr Zelenskyy would be brought here, as he said, because that would be easiest to come up with a deal to end this war. But separately, I'm struck by what I think a lot of critics are going to note right now, which is, in effect, that the Russian President Vladimir Putin appears to have gotten most everything that he wanted from this visit here. He got a photo op with the President of the United States where the red carpet was rolled out. They shared the stage and handshakes and smiles. They also shared a ride in the Beast. Separately, there is no, at least as it appears at this time, ceasefire that was agreed to, which is to say that Vladimir Putin can continue his offensive taking place in Ukraine right now. And finally, perhaps most notably, he avoided sanctions, additional sanctions that were supposed to to go into effect this time last week. You'll remember it was a week ago that was in effect the deadline day for more sanctions to be levied by the United States against Russia unless this war came to an end, unless they agreed to a ceasefire. Well, it doesn't appear that those new sanctions have gone into effect right now. And if nothing else, this extends that window for the Russians. So I think in many ways, a lot of critics of this visit in particular will view that as one way that Vladimir Putin won. Donald Trump will suggest that he had some success because he was able to make some progress. What that progress is remains unclear, but as Richard and our colleagues have indicated, perhaps for the Ukrainians in particular, they can rest assured that no deal was reached without them present, which allows in some form this to extend. The sad fact, though, is that that means the war in Ukraine also continues unabated.
Yeah.
Tom?
And all that killing. Peter, we thank you. Stand by for us. Speaking of Richard Engel, I want to go to him now. He's live in Ukraine for us. Richard, I know you've been sort of analyzing everything that we've been analyzing and try to glean anything from the statements that were made. One important thing President Trump did say that we should note, saying that they agreed on a lot of small things, but there was one big thing they couldn't agree on, that they weren't able to agree on one big thing. We don't know what that big thing is. It could have been the land swap. It could have been the territory that Russia has sort of conquered at this point, 20% of Ukraine. We don't know what that is. But you're from the school of thought, from seeing this. You think that possibly there could be a real deal on the table, and President Trump is essentially waiting for approval from all sides?
Well, Vladimir Putin was certainly talking about a deal as if a deal has been done. And President Trump was saying that they've agreed on a lot of points, but not one, and that he's got to talk to NATO, he's got to talk to President Zelenskyy. He had just agreed to President Zelenskyy and European allies, including the Secretary General of NATO, that he would do exactly that he wouldn't go to Alaska, that he wouldn't sign his name on the dotted line, and he wouldn't make any rushed agreements. So it's possible that there is an agreement, as Vladimir Putin says there is, an agreement that Kyiv is not going to like, and that the Europeans are not going to like, and that he's just got to deliver that news to President Zelenskyy and the Europeans. But that is still, that means that this process is still underway. It means that the President Zelenskyy gets a vote. That means that the Europeans can add their concerns. Nobody here in Ukraine wants this war to continue. Everybody here wants this war to stop. But what Ukrainians are concerned about is that if President Trump or Vladimir Putin today had announced a deal unilaterally, that it wouldn't stop the war, that it would just set up a bigger, more serious conflict in which more Ukrainians would lose their lives. So it's not that Ukrainians are anxious to keep this war going and that they want to keep sending their sons and daughters to the front lines every single day, but they thought a bad deal is worse than no deal. And it seems like there's still possibility to reach a better deal.
Richard, both sides are losing lives essentially almost every minute of the day in this war. You've covered so many wars and conflicts. How hard is it to get a ceasefire in place? And maybe the better question is, how quickly will it take for a ceasefire to really be active in this region? Because the president mentioned something about saving thousands of lives every day.
So this war, Tom, and I've covered a lot of wars, as you mentioned, this war is all about land. Wars in the Middle East are often about identity or about religion and history. There is some of that here as well, but this one is primarily about land. Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist as an independent country, and he wants their land. And 3.5 years ago, he invaded this country with the intention of taking all of Ukraine, toppling the government, getting rid of Zelenskyy, putting in a puppet, and taking control of Ukraine the way that Ukraine was dominated under the Soviet Union. It didn't work. The Ukrainians fought back, but the Russians are still on Ukrainian territory. They're still holding 20% of Ukrainian land. So reaching a ceasefire just means the fighting stops. But what about that 20%? What about the Ukrainian troops who are on the front line? Do they pull back? What about the thousands of Russian troops who are launching attacks every day on Ukrainians from Ukrainian soil? Do they get to stay? Do those battle lines become permanent? And those are all the questions that Ukrainians want to know. And those are the questions that Ukrainians say must be answered. Otherwise, there will never be anything like a lasting peace agreement, that you can have a ceasefire, but that you'll have more conflicts down the road unless you address those fundamental questions. So this is a hard one. Even if we get a ceasefire, and maybe we do get a ceasefire announcement in the next couple of days or next week, then the very difficult process begins of the territorial discussions. Do the Russians get to stay on the land that they have conquered, or do they have to leave? And Vladimir Putin has made it very, very clear that he has no intention of pulling back his troops.
Richard Engel, we thank you. Garrett Haake, while I have you for less than a minute here, President Trump will return back to Washington, D.C. He's going to be handling a lot, but this is not going to go away anytime soon.
No, it's not. And perhaps even before he takes off, Tom, we're going to have what will be the most scrutinized conference call, perhaps, in history of this conflict. The president said he would brief European leaders and President Zelenskyy on what exactly went down during this summit, which President Putin described as an agreement, and one that he didn't want to see European leaders interfere with. What comes out of that call will, I think, set up the next stages in this conflict and the discussions to end it.
All right, Garrett Haake first. Garrett, we thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more coverage on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCnews.com, and I'll see many of you in just a minute for Nightly News. I'm Tom Yamas, live in Anchorage, Alaska. We thank you for watching tonight.